morning, everyone, and welcome back, and welcome to those of you who were not here yesterday. Yesterday was a marathon of absolutely fascinating presentations, comments, questions, and discussions, and we're so thrilled to continue today's panels and discussions. So my name is Maria Mileva, and I'm a lecturer here at the purview. And I'm here to give you a very short introduction to say welcome. In terms of housekeeping, there is a fire exit on this side. You walk all the way down into the garden where you can gather up and get some sunshine. I can see sunshine outside. The bathrooms, there's one bathroom out here. There are more bathrooms upstairs or one floor down. And today's program will be first a keynote from Dr. Konstantin Akinsha, and after that we'll have refreshments with coffee, so please bear with us that there will be coffee for everyone after the keynote and questions. And after that we'll have our final panel with questions and discussions. So before I introduce Konstantin Akinsha, just to say that there are some more programs that have been printed out, so if you didn't get one, then I'm going to leave them here, but also pass one over. There we go. And we have a number of Ukraine-related charities that you can support with QR codes, and I'm going to leave them at the front for those of you who didn't get that yesterday. So there we go. And without further ado, we are thrilled to invite and welcome our second keynote, Dr. Konstantin Akinsha, who is an independent art historian, curator, and journalist. He received his PhD from the University of Edinburgh and served as the Deputy Director of the Art Section in the Presidential Advisory Commission on Holocaust Assets in the US from 1998 to 2000. He was a contributing editor at Art News magazine and received the George Polk Award for Cultural Reporting in 1991, among numerous other journalistic awards. And I'm sure you have all been reading the very prolific commentary and journalistic commentary from Konstantin in the past 2 years as well, about the destruction of Ukraine's cultural heritage by Russia. His curatorial projects include Russian Modernism, Cross-Currents of German and Russian Art, 1907 to 1917, at the Neue Gallery in New York in 2015, Permanent Revolution, Ukrainian Art Today, which was held at Ludwig Museum in Budapest in 2018, Between Fire and Fire, Ukrainian Art Now, at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna in 2019, and In the Eye of the Storm, Modernism in Ukraine, as you know, has been traveling and is right now at the Royal Academy and there for you to see before it closes on the 13th of October. So make sure you see it before it leaves London. He's the founding director of the Avant-Garde Art Research Project based in UK, and is the author of several books, including Beautiful Loot, The Soviet Plunder of Europe's Art Treasures, published in 1995. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Konstantin.
I want to make a disclaimer. Because my speech today will be unpleasant, disturbing, and probably could create some rejection of people in the auditorium. So be ready for this. I want to talk about historiography of Ukrainian modernism. Those tasks which we are facing today, and those numerous problems which literally mushroom since the beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine. But let's look a bit into history of discovery and popularization of the Ukrainian modernism. We will divide this section in two, in European and North American, because this division is necessary. As you can imagine, under the Soviet rule, Ukrainian modernism was not the topic broadly discussed in Ukraine. Bibliography of this period could be basically counted on the fingers of one palm. In the 60s, during the Khrushchev thaw, this modernism was finally mentioned just by slight touch in the history of Ukrainian art. Some books were published, like album on Petritsky by Vrona. Every publication like this was a heroic act because it had to go through Ukrainian censorship. And as usually, Moscow was more liberal than Kiev, because Dmitro Gorbachev had to publish his book on Petritsky, which was, of course, compromise book, typical product of the Soviet time, but still it had to be published by Искусство Publishing House in Moscow. Even more complicated was the fate of the very good, even for the time period, book by Zinovy Fogel on Vasily Yermilov, which was published in Moscow, but it needed some camouflage. And the book was published as a book in the series, or let's say decorative propaganda. So Yermilov was reduced to decorator. Interest to Ukrainian modernism restarted, of course, on the eve of the fall of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, it's coincided with a general situation on the art market, and what later was called Ukrainian avant-garde became, since the beginning of the process, a vehicle for, let's say, market buccaneers, and vehicle for sale of fakes. You see on the screen a cover of the book of Valentino Marcadet, published in 1990, which was an effort of the first, let's say, general narrative of the history of Ukrainian art from Adam to our days. And on the cover of this book, you can see the notorious fake of Alexandra Exter from so-called collection of Kurt Benedict, which became co-celebrity of the fake scandals of the 1990s. Unfortunately, the book itself had other interesting examples of fakes. We don't have time now to discuss this. The same year, probably the first and the best exhibition of Ukrainian modernism, first exhibition traveling out of Ukraine to European country, was opened in the City Museum in Zagreb. It was a collaborative project of Croatian curators and Ukrainian curators, so Dmitro Gorbachev. And this was the first exhibition, which unfortunately, tradition of which was not continued. It was exhibition absolutely deprived of fakes. In the same time, for the first time, definition Ukrainian avant-garde was used. So it's the beginning of formation of the narrative of Ukrainian avant-garde, which became a kind of mirror of the narrative of a Russian avant-garde. You know that the term Russian avant-garde today is seriously contested. I was recently in Germany and was pleased to see German PhD students, not even art historians, working on dissertation about definition of Russian avant-garde as a Cold War construct. I believe that it's, of course, it's a Cold War construct. It's, let's say, contradiction in terms, because the definition avant-garde as such was very popular in the 60s. You remember Peter Berger book, and of course, prehistory of this term. Initially, art smuggled from the Soviet Union was called revolutionary avant-garde, but for market definition, Russian was much better. So it was umbrella definition created by the market, and then after the fall of the Soviet Union, readopted by the Russian Federation as an official concept of development of Russian and Soviet modernism. I don't want to waste time on this. Those who are interested could look at my article naming Russian avant-garde, which was published in the catalog of Cologne exhibition of fake artworks in the collection of the Peter Ludwig Museum. So, as I told you, the exhibition in Zagreb, which introduced conception of Russian or Ukrainian avant-garde, was fake-free. Unfortunately, other important exhibitions were not. You see cover of the catalog of exhibition prepared by Villa Stuck in 1993. This exhibition was highly polluted by fakes, and you can see the cover of the catalog of the exhibition Crossroads Modernism in Ukraine, which in 2006 was shown in the National Museum in Kiev and then traveled to the United States. This exhibition, unfortunately, was heavily polluted by fakes from private collections. On the cover, you see the fake of Yermilov relief. And this is a very big problem because it's not only the question of market, it's not only the question of rich people wasting their money for fake art. It's a question of art history because these works circulating later in the scholarly publication and polluting and destroying our objective understanding of the artistic process. Conception of Ukrainian avant-garde was most of all advocated by Dmitro Gorbachev, who started to write about this in 1996. So the first book, which you can see, Ukrainian avant-garde art 1910-1930s, was published in 1996, and Gorbachev is continuing this line, constantly repeating the definition avant-garde. I believe that it's a misleading definition. I think the definition modernist is much more applicable because in Ukrainian case, many of important modernist artists hardly could be classified as avant-garde. They never basically called themselves avant-garde. And we have Russian situation when the word avant-garde was never used for the self-definition, was mentioned 2 times by art critics in Russia like Benoit and Punin, 2 times mentioned in the publications of Novice and 1 time in Less. And in Ukraine, of course, we had Kharkiv magazine of Polishchuk, which was called Avant-Garde, but it was referring not to artistic development, but the political standing of this magazine. Just short remark, why in the Soviet Union avant-garde could not be applicable to art? For very simple reason. Because Lenin in one of his works coined the slogan, the Communist Party is the avant-garde of proletarians. So all numerous football clubs mushrooming around the Soviet Union by 1930s and called avant-garde were not called after Malevich. Yeah, so in case of Ukraine, I think that modernism is much more correct definition because again, Boychuk, who initially was retrospectivist, hardly could be classified as avant-garde to my belief. So that was line in Europe. In America, the line was different. And unfortunately, fortunately, I have to say that North American scholarship of Ukrainian modernism in quality is not comparable to European efforts. Miroslava is here. We already discussed her book. This book was formative for my generation of art historians and for future generations too. Unfortunately, during the Soviet days, we, in the best case, could have like very rusty Xerox copies, which were given and passed to each other to read them in one night. Finally, this book was reprinted in Ukrainian. I want to mention another scholar who is, of course, mainly literary scholar, Oleg Khmelnytsky, whose impact on research of Ukrainian modernism is extremely important, and who introduced conception of intercultural role of different artists, saying that, let's say, in case of Malevich, both Russian and Ukrainian culture has claim for Malevich, and its interpretation of Malevich, and the same with Baruch, the same with Exter, which is a right and correct approach in the moment of nationalization of artists, to which we will return later. After the independence, situation changed, but it was changing very slowly. Of course, today we have many interesting publications, etc., but I want to mention one extremely important exhibition project, which was exhibition organized by National Museum of Ukraine in 2018 and curated by Yulia Litvinets, the director of museum today, which was called Spetsfond. Of course, the first effort in the catalog may be not perfect and it needs more work, and they will do this work, but it was first introduction of dozens and dozens of paintings which remained unseen since the moment where they were exiled in these secret repositories, which in many ways opened for us the generation of Ukrainian artists of late 20s, which we had no idea about. It was an important step, but we still facing a lot of important steps. And I think that Ukrainian art history now is facing a lot of problems. I'm talking about concrete research which has to be done. I can give you examples from the top of my head. Miroslava, in her book, was the first person who wrote about Ukrainian photography of the period, focusing on Dan Sotnik and his works for the new generation. Did somebody do something serious on Ukrainian photography of the period after this? No. We have no idea what was Ukrainian photography of the period, despite the fact that the institute, Kiev Art Institute, had photography and theater department where Tatlin was teaching. What he was teaching, we have no idea. We had annual photography exhibition since mid-20s to the early 30s. What was exhibited at this exhibition, we have no idea. So there are many white spots which were not addressed and have to be addressed. But it's a concrete work. Now the main problem to my taste is a narrative of the history of Ukrainian modernism. Of course, we are not living in the time of grand narratives anymore, and these grand narratives contested in the West, but we need some narrative, and this narrative now is in construction. Of course, we are understanding that it's a very difficult time, that this time is very emotional, and sometimes these emotions are overwhelming. But what we are observing is weaponization of art and art history on both sides of the divide. And I have to say that some developments with construction of narratives of Ukrainian modernism in contemporary Ukraine is minimum disturbing. Let's start with Malevich. This story started a bit earlier than the second stage of Russian war against Ukraine, but 4 years after the initial beginning of annexation of Ukrainian territories. In 2018, Ukrainian Post Authority published this beautiful stamp dedicated to Malevich with reproduction of his painting from the collection of the Arsenal Museum. This painting is coming from the collection of Igor Dichenko and very loudly called Suprematism #1. I can say that I don't know any serious Malevich expert who has minimal doubts about authenticity of this painting. It's obviously extremely questionable artwork. And I think that museum could undertake some efforts to understand what they have in their collection. So appearance of questionable artwork on the post stamp issued by the National Post Authority was not very good sign. Here is a Parkhomovka Museum. It's a beautiful village museum. It's a beautiful story, very touching. It basically was formed by one person who was enthusiast, this, let's say, Heimat enthusiasm, who was collecting art, collected a lot of art. But unfortunately, this museum has two beautiful works like this Malevich watercolor, which again reproduced and exhibited. It was even during Malevich Jubileum exhibition of one work in Kharkiv Museum. And here you can see it in exposition. So Parkhomovka did not limit themselves by Malevich, they also have Kandinsky. So just to give you, and it's, it doesn't, we don't need to discuss this, but so it's a real Kandinsky, which is a famous work in the private collection, and it's a version in Parkhomovka Museum. This is constantly celebrated by press. This is constantly reproduced and returned, and it's our pride. We perfectly know that we have in Ukraine only one authentic work of Malevich, which is in the collection of the National Art Museum. We know provenance of this work. This work is very interesting, and I think that it's worth of very detailed description, serious research article. I'm talking not only about sketch for decoration of the Academy of Science of Ukraine, which is showing how realistic was Malevich, who in 28 could imagine that something like this could be painted in the Academy of Science. But so late return to the suprematist compositions, which is again extremely interesting and interesting for understanding of Malevich approach to endless return and rework of his compositions. But that was situation before the war. What started with the war? We had very heated discussion about Malevich Ukrainian or Malevich Russian, etc., etc. Now it's a very serious problem, how to redo museum labels. Of course, it's coming to parodic elements like this famous battle of Ayvazovsky, who was, after efforts of Ukrainian activists, turned by the Metropolitan Museum of Arts into Ukrainian, just to be turned in 2 weeks into Armenian after loud protest of Armenian diaspora in United States of America. But it's an interesting question, because if you will look at museum labels now, international, you will find that museum officials are unable to take things straight, because we have these artists who were born in the cities which did not exist when they were born, or died in the countries which did not exist when they died, etc., etc. I'm just collaborating now with French, who are seriously trying to create a commission which will look at the question of museum labels in French museums. And again, in the moment, dissertations are written about museum labeling. But, of course, there is such issue like self-identification. In his memoirs, which Malevich wrote on request of Khargev, he stated, "I am a Ukrainian." We did not have other statements. Of course, Malevich was situational, but we did not have text where he's writing, "I am a Russian" or "I am a Pole." I am a Ukrainian. We have this text. This is enough of ground to count Malevich Ukrainian. Of course, another question that he spent longest part of his creative activity was connected to Russia, and he's a part of Russian culture too, and you cannot remove it from this culture. In the same time, of course, he's a part of Ukrainian culture, because his stay in Ukraine was instrumental for Ukrainian Art Institute. He left a very strong imprint on development of so-called last generation of Ukrainian modernist artists, etc. But it's not enough. We have to create more, let's say, weaponized narratives. And this is a narrative which is now becoming official policy of Ukraine. Here you can see, and I want you to read this. It's a website of the Ukrainian Museum of Holodomor, which is reporting that Malevich was depicting Holodomor, referring to his artworks, like this drawing. This is a construct which was basically launched by Dmitro Gorbachev, who named this drawing Hammering Circle, Famine and Death, referring to Ukrainian folk song of the period. I became interested in this folk song, and my maybe not fundamental search demonstrated that the same song is claimed by Belarusian, with some change of words, hammering circle on the gates, famine and death in collective farms. It's claimed by Russians in the version hammering circle on the gates, death and famine in the house, etc., etc. But there is no song. If the song existed, the lyrics of this song have to exist. People are not singing two lines. So, it's a mythological construct. Interpretation of this drawing could be various. And to construct the whole theory of Malevich and Holodomor based on this drawing, it's as minimum mistake. Then another probe, it's a painting from the collection of the State Russian Museum, which through the history of existence of this painting was called Peasants, but then unexpectedly it's turned into painting with the name Captive Ukraine. Why it is Captive Ukraine? What are sources? Any sources? proving that this painting in some way connected to Ukraine. The website of Museum of Holodomor is stating that it's captive Ukraine because these people have no faces and no hands. And because of this, Malevich demonstrated suffering of Ukrainian people. I'm sorry, it's a general trope of modern art, and many are forgetting about this Matisse painting. Of course, the main start to facelessness in modernist painting was given not by Matisse, by De Chirico. And there is a well-grounded article by Charlotte Douglas, De Chirico and Malevich. And this article could be impossible without help of Miroslava, who during that time provided Charlotte Douglas with references to Ukrainian publications of the Chirico painting and Ukrainian interest to Italian art of the period. And the article proving that Malevich obviously saw the Chirico works and probably was influenced by them. And he was not alone, because this facelessness is becoming trope of modern art of the period. You can see Gross painting, Bortnik painting, and it's starting way before Malevich coming to the same model. And of course the third painting, which Gorbachev is connecting with the folk song "У дороги хрест високий," tall cross near the road, etc., etc. We have unbelievable quantity of interpretations of this painting, which is a fantastic interpretations, again, not based on any reality. I discussed this, there is a publication of Alexandra Shatskikha in the volume which she made with Sarabianov, which unfortunately this text is not included in the multi-volume Malevich writings, which includes Malevich text on so-called running men, which is really could be connected to this painting. But again, I'm talking about hypothesis because I don't want to become a soothsayer, finding new names and new interpretations of Malevich paintings. But this running man already changed his name many times. So we are just renaming Malevich paintings. I can accept hypothesis that Malevich knew something about Holodomor. I don't know how he could know this, but maybe. But there is no one indication, no one letter, no one page of his writings, no one secondary source, let's say memoirs of his contemporaries. Okay, maybe Malevich did not want to write about it because he was afraid of political repercussions, etc., etc. But he was surrounded by people. And after the Second World War, everybody from Lamach, Padua, Nakov, name the name, came through these people. Yeah. Wiley Porska, if she knew that Malevich was so influenced by Holodomor, did not tell it to Padua or Nakov or anybody else who was visiting her, or to Royal Sanderson, for example. It was a stream of scholars, experts, etc., going through this. We don't have one secondary proof of this influence of Holodomor. We are talking about scholarship. We are not talking about creation of legends. Unfortunately, it's becoming official legend now. And again, what we have the mantra that this is the act of accusation of Holodomor by Malevich. It's very disturbing because, we are facing Russia, which is producing and overproducing false ideological and false historical narratives. I don't believe that we have to oppose this propaganda street with something similar, but created by Ukrainians. Yesterday, I want very briefly to touch this topic. It's a very complicated topic. We started to come to the decolonization and colonial discourse, etc., etc. And I fully agree with speakers who were speaking yesterday that this topic has to be addressed very carefully. Of course, contemporary post-colonial theory cannot be applied to this situation at all. Classical post-colonial discourse is not applicable to, let's say, maybe in a sense, Said is applicable to Central Asia, but Homi Bhabha and Spivak will not help us. On the other hand, we are lacking apparatus, we are lacking definitions, because Soviet colonialism is not classical colonialism. It's not British Empire, not even Russian Empire. It's a so-called colonialism of affirmative action, which needs to be specified. It's a very strange thing. It's extremely interesting, and I am sorry that contemporary historians are not there yet. All these efforts of Ab Imperium journal, which are good, but they did not come to the story. And we have to be careful, and we have to understand that we were not only subjugated, we were builders of both empires, of the Russian Empire and Soviet Empire. It's a very complicated story. And it's very complicated when we are coming to the general mantra that Russians stole everything from us. They did, but it's not as simple. I want to show you this slide and ask you what is common between these two paintings. Can somebody answer? Just to specify, on the left is a painting by Kuinji, The Red Sunset on Dnieper, which was in the Kuinji Museum in Mariupol and which was stolen by Russian troops and removed to unknown location, according to Ukrainian military intelligence, to the city of Donetsk, but it's unproved situation. And this is a painting of Alexandra Exter, which you saw at the exhibition at Royal Academy. So what is common?
Was stolen by Russia.
No. Both were sent to Ukrainian museums by the Ministry of Culture of the Soviet Union. And both were not in the Ukrainian collections initially. So, which is not excuse for Russian troops to strip it. We are facing extremely interesting situation because the whole history of the Soviet museums is tragic, insane, and sometimes surreal. We have endless removal and of artworks from one location to another. On the other hand, of course, Exter is sent to Ukraine when avant-garde collections or radical modernist collection from Moscow has to be thrown everywhere to be hidden. So some of them are hidden in Moscow, some of them are hidden in, in Baku, and some of them are hidden in Ukraine. But returning to Kuinji, it's another story. It's an extremely interesting form of, I can say, cultural colonialism, cultural domination. It's a stripping Tretyakov gallery in the State Russian Museum of their works and sending them to most unbelievable places because this Russian art had to be present everywhere. And there are massive redistributions after the Second World War when it looks that there are already that Ukraine have tons of this Russian art in every provincial museum. But they are sending hundreds of paintings to Tajikistan. So Tajikistan has to have Shishkin, because without Shishkin, Tajik culture cannot exist. It's a very interesting question. In the same time, of course, they are taking things from Ukraine, like the famous mosaic from Mikhailovsky Zlatoverkhy monastery and sending it to Moscow to the Trettikov gallery. So very often this movement is deprived of any logic. Very often it has ideological foundation. So that has to be researched, it has to be looked at, and we have to have some documentary base to understand it. And now I want to take one, let's say, study case. And I want to look at the fate of works of one Ukrainian artist, important Ukrainian modernist, which giving us some answer, unfortunately very sad answers of what did happen to Ukrainian modernists, to its legacy, and who actually stole it. I want to concentrate on Vasily Yermilov. And of course, I will not address the whole corpus of works of Yermilov. I want to talk mainly about reliefs and, in some cases, works on paper which are in foreign museum collections. So, in all of Ukraine, Yermilov is the most important, as we calling him, Ukrainian constructivist. In all of Ukraine, we have only one relief of Yermilov, which is in Arsenal Museum, and it's an Arsenal Museum only because, by a sheer miracle, the director of the museum succeeded to purchase a part of collection of Igor Dichenko, important collector of modernism in Kiev. Only one. So, where are other works? This memorial plaque to Lenin is in Ludwig Museum Cologne. Ludwig Museum Cologne was purchasing these works from various sources in the, or that was still not museum collection, it was private collection of Peter Ludwig in early 80s. Ludwig also purchased this sketch for Kanatka wool newspaper, which was exhibited in the press exhibition. But of course, people who were selling him stuff decided that it's too many real scenes, so they also sold him this beautiful fake relief. And it's not clear what is this, because I think that it's some Soviet product of the 1960s, and probably it was 50, and they just removed 0, and it was some relief dedicated to the 50th jubileum of the October Revolution. We are continuing our story. So, that European collections. We are going to North America. This composition number 3, which is in collection of MoMA and which is now hanging at my exhibition Junctions in the Mid Museum in Amherst. It was a lot of discussion because Ukrainian art historians demanded MoMA not only to change the spelling of the name of Yermilov, but change the positioning of this composition. They were right and wrong, because at the Yermilov exhibition in Kharkiv, it was exhibited like this. But at the Polishchuk book, which was basically designed by Yermilov, it was exhibited in the different way, like it was initially exhibited in MoMA. But there is a question, because something is lacking. And now you see what is lacking, because outer frame, which is a part of this relief, at some moment was lost. And in reality, this relief has to look like this. So maybe it's not a bad idea for MoMA to undertake partial reconstruction of it, because we have not the full work. We have main part of the work, but not the whole work in the collection. It's another example of not very precise description and not very precise dating of works which are in collection of American museums. It's As you can see, it's again in collection of MoMA, New York, dated by 1927, and it's called Composition in Primary Colors. Obviously, it's not composition in primary colors, it's a sketch of architectural designs for the famous project of the Palace of young pioneers and activists in Kharkiv, and we easily can date it by 1935, because he did not work on these projects earlier. This is another important relief of Yermilov in American collections, which is my pride, because this relief was like magically found during preparation of exhibition in Amherst. It was not difficult to find it because it was sitting in the collection of ATG Buffalo since 1974. In Buffalo Museum, they had no idea that this work is important. The name of Yermilov was not only spelled in Russian way, it was just misspelled. And this exhibition was, this relief also was exhibited in Kharkiv, and in Ukrainian literature and in general literature on Yermilov, from Parnis to Pavlova, it was mentioned that this relief is lost. And this is the last work in American museums. It's a work in the LA County Museum, again, untitled composition, circa 1925. It's very interesting because this composition is coming to LACMA through a gallery of Jean Chauvelin. It's unlikely fake, like many works from the gallery of Jean Chauvelin, but we are having some kind of cognitive dissonance. It's very interesting what we are seeing here. Of course, it cannot be 1925. It's coming nearly into postmodernism with these strange references. One part of the panel is basically a version of his font composition, which now is in collection or in the gallery of Vladimir Tsarenko. Another part is a bit repainted classics from Galleria Borghese. So, what is my guess? But it's a theory. This is another unknown composition of Yermilov. The composition of Yermilov, which location we have no idea about, which was reproduced by Fogel. And as you can see, it's again references to the history of art and references to Yermilov works combined together. This work was created in 1960s, and I have feeling that this work was created in 1960s too. Of course, we need more research. Then we came through museums, and now we have private collections, which we can divide in stable private collections, like, let's say, Sephiroth Foundation in Liechtenstein. This work is very known. It was at the Great Utopia. It was on the cover of the Russian version of the catalog of the Great Utopia. But okay, we know where is it. It's available for loans. It's available from art historians. And this is a self-portrait from which we saw in Royal Academy from Alex Lachman collection. And then we have mysteries, because if the works are coming to international art market and sold by respected auction houses, it doesn't mean that we will see them again. And one of the main mysteries of Yermilov, it's this known work, Matchbox, which was auctioned in 1987 by Sotheby Park Bennett in New York, never seen afterwards. It was never included in any exhibition, never reproduced, never mentioned. Nobody knows where is it. It's happening not only to such old things. For example, this counter-relief from Lenin cycle was changing hands few times. The last sale, 1989, I asked Sotheby's to contact the buyer. The buyer died, and his son has no idea where is this work. and cannot even locate documents about it. This is another beautiful mystery. It's a real, important Yermilov relief, well documented. And you have to understand that Yermilov legacy is really well documented, which is popping up in London in the secondary auction house recently, relatively short time ago, sold for minimal price. Minimal price. Again, somehow auction house is refusing to name or claiming that they cannot find to whom they sold this for. And again, it's never popped out since 2011 at any exhibitions. Another mystery. This we don't know what happened to, because this is probably early smuggling from the Soviet Union. It's in private collection. It was reproduced in color in the book of Gorbachev, so he had some connections with the collector, but never appeared at any exhibitions. Two words on the story. It was two waves of smuggling of Yermilov. It's a Soviet period smuggling, which was starting with Nakov, with Anneli Juda exhibition on constructivism, like Russian constructivism, because demand was high and supply was low, and Yermilov was perfect manifestation of so-called Russian constructivism. So 70s, 80s, finishing with exhibition in New York, in Ingrid Cotton Gallery in the 80s. And another wave of smuggling came with Ukrainian independence. So what we lost, and this was not taken by Russians by force. It was nicely sold to these Russians. Like this relief which you saw on the cover of the catalog of the Zagreb exhibition. Like this relief, both of them are from Ivakin collection. Both of them are in Moscow, and this is the most tragic scene. It's really a masterpiece of Yermilov, and together with other works, because I am not including paintings, works on paper. It was in a private collection of what is his name? The Georgian, the dissident. I will remember. It's confiscated in Ukraine by KGB. It was in the National Museum of Ukraine, Grigorians, in collection of Grigorians. Grigorians was sent to prison. All of this was confiscated, sent to the National Museum of Ukraine. After the independence, Grigorians sued Ukraine, and the court decided that these confiscated materials have to be returned to him. In that moment, we are talking about 1991, 1992. Grigorians addressed National Museum of Ukraine, offering to sell all of his collection. For, in that moment, it sounds like a large sum, but today it looks like peanuts and parody. Nobody even discussed such a possibility. Said, it's yours, take it. So all of this came to Moscow. Unfortunately, it was sold to very questionable oligarch of kind of semi-Ukrainian provenance, Mr. Grigorishin, who in that moment he had no passport except proud passport of the state of Cyprus. It was in Moscow. Then Grigorishin did not pay some taxes. It was confiscated by Russian tax authority, and it's somewhere in Russia, confiscated somewhere. It's a huge collection. We obviously can say that it was the best collection of Ukrainian art, which is lost forever, because we don't know what will happen to this collection. And again, it's a very sad story. Now I want to address story which I already addressed. It's in the profile of Yermila. It's a problem of fakes. Yermila probably is the most faked Ukrainian modernist artist. We have avalanche of these beautiful scenes. The first and the second appeared in the early days in Morzhinskaya gallery. Finally, the work in the center was classified as the work from Kurt Benedict collection, despite the fact that Kurt Benedict never could reach Ukraine and Yermilov never was in Moscow at that period. So it's a one line, and this is the second line of quote-unquote suprematist works. I'm giving you just a teaser because we are talking about dozens and dozens of these fakes. And this is the most strange line, where Yermilov is turning into kind of, let's say, predecessor of Tanguy, creating these mechanical scenes. You have to understand that it's not jokes. All of these scenes are going through the auction houses. Maybe not through the biggest auction houses, but the second row of European auction houses selling these scenes endlessly. And now we are coming to the sad conclusion of my article. You see the opening of the two exhibitions which are hosted today now in Ukrainian Museum, New York. One of these exhibitions is on Alexandra Exter, and another one on Ukrainian modernism. It's called Vola, which vaguely could be translated as freedom. And here you can see our ambassador to the United States and our president, Mr. Zelensky, with interesting works on background. Here are labels. A museum is not bothering itself with providing any dates of exhibited works. So what we have? We have this work. I can say it's not obviously documented in any Yermilov archives. We don't have photographs of this masterpiece, and it's a very strange symbiosis of Yermilov portraits and Yermilov suprematist work. Yermilov was perfectionist of materials. This is unbelievably strange, rough scene with some compositional abnormalities which is difficult even to explain, like this piece of wood stuck in the mouth of this poor creature. This work was attributed by Dmitry Kharbachev, and it was proudly exhibited on his website. However, I talked about this work before in the conference in Kyiv a few years ago, before COVID, and we had a discussion about this, and then it disappeared from Kharbachev's website. But of course, in Cache you can find many things which are staying there, unfortunately, forever. The question is that many serious art historians who are dealing with Yermilov are fully convinced that this work is not real. But for this you did not have to go to doctors, because if you have eyes, you practically look at this, especially interesting how it's painted, like this absolutely uneven painting, a rough woodwork, absence of screws, because Yermilov was using very specific screws. You can basically know specifications of these screws. He did not glue things, usually. So you just can make elementary comparison. You are historians, you have eyes, and you can come to your judgment. The second work in the exhibition is not less mysterious, but is it a fake? I actually initially believed that it's a fake. It was sold by Swedish auction. It's coming from auction house in Uppsala, of the second-rate or third-rate auction house. Never heard about it, which was the last sale. But I think that in this case, it's more complicated. Again, this work is glued. Again, some materials like fiberboard cannot be from the 20s. It's not presented in any Yermilov documentation. But there is an interesting thing. It's an old sale. So first time before Uppsala, it's popped up in 1974. So it's the first buccaneering and robbery of Ukraine at the Sotheby's sale. And you can see there are the works which we saw today. So it's Alice magnet, which doesn't mean anything either, because tradition of the fakers was to add something fake with something real. But here we come into other interesting story. In the book of Pavlov, there is a photographs of some materials prepared for some documentary film planned about Yermilov in 1960s and never finished. Among the things, there is this photograph of something which they saw in Yermilov's studio. I think that this photograph was crooked few times and printed on different sides, so I had to roll this relief, because as you can see, in reality it looks like this, to understand that it's corresponding to this model. But now we have a question which we cannot answer. It's highly unlikely that this work was produced in 1920s, and highly likely that it's produced in 1960s. But we don't have any proof that Yermilov was reproducing his works of the early period in 1960s. He had different interests. Alexander Parny is fully convinced that he never did anything like this. So we have anomaly which needs serious research. And of course, probably it's possible to use contemporary technological means like carbon analysis of paintings and bindings of materials to find what is this. But what I want to say that unfortunately, Ukrainian Museum in New York did not bother itself to treat these works with some critical approach, and as a minimum to avoid fakes and to give some explanation and description for the works which are provoking questions. I thought that Yermilov was interesting example, and it's given a feeling about what happened to other works of Ukrainian modernist artists. We can return to this study cases with Bogomazov, with Petritsky, etc., etc. Thank you very much.
We're going to take some questions before we break for coffee. And just a reminder that we are recording the proceedings, so there is a roving mic, so please raise your hand if you have a question and wait for the microphone. Yuri. Just quite close to you.
Okay, I have no quarrel with your assertion that Ukrainians en masse participated in the construction of the Russian Empire, as they do now. One of the closest confidants of Putin are two Ukrainian brothers whose names are I'm forgetting. But can you give me a single example when a Ukrainian empire builder was allowed to stay Ukrainian, or even more so, and this is
I can give you all the.
this kind of argument is written about or addressed by Miroslav Skandri in his book on Ukrainian Russian literature. Ukrainians, when they were allowed to preserve their identity individually, have never been allowed under these conditions to preserve it as a group, as a collectivity.
I want to make a comment on this. Of course, Russian Empire is different, and we have a famous construct of Gritsak, who said that Ukrainians started as the Scots and finished as Irish, which of course has good ground in it. Talking about Soviet Union, there are millions of individual Ukrainians which had to be Ukrainians, like, I don't know, let's take 60s, Mr. Shelist, for example.
And we know what he ended up as.
Yeah, of course, it's another story. But don't forget that in Soviet Ukraine, where I grew up, was a ritual block of Ukrainians, Soviet Ukrainians, which had to be nailed into your head by daily propaganda. If you think that folk art and gapak were prohibited, you are grossly mistaken, because they were aired by TV 24 hours a day. And it was a very interesting situation. We have a ritual saving of Ukrainian language, like Ukrainian TV program, which nobody was watching because everybody wanted to watch Russian TV program. We have ritual Ukrainian newspapers, ritual Ukrainian Union of Writers, but it was not only, it was general model of Soviet nationality program. It's like beautiful newspaper, Sovjetische Gameland, published in Jewish autonomous region of Azerbaijan, where by that time there are 5 Jews who can read it, and all of them were writing it. Because you had to have this ritual object. It's like you cannot imagine to which extent people of my generation were like puking when we saw this official Ukrainian, Soviet Ukrainians, which was constantly enforced on us. It's very funny because now people are forgetting that it was a part of the ideological program. And it was specific literature which was enforced on us. So, what I am becoming very scary now, it's not connected to this presentation. It's attempts in Ukraine to rehabilitate these late-day Soviet monsters like Sherbitsky, because they were not Russian but Ukrainian. They were worse than Russians.
Exactly.
Yeah, we have very good Croatian expression, which is not politically correct, that Aturchiny is worse than Turk. Yeah, so they were Turchin. And now to find some excuse for them, it's really scary.
We'll take 2 questions, maybe 3, and then you can. First, Michal at the back.
Thanks for very rich presentation, which I suppose posed more questions than it answered. But I wanted to go back to one thing you said about the distinction between Russian and Soviet Empire and classical empires. And you cautioned against the application of, as Polina did yesterday, against the application of post-colonial or decolonial theory to the case of Ukraine, or perhaps the case of the Russian or Soviet empires in general, on the basis of the fact that they were not classical empires. And this is something that I find problematic. What is a classical empire?
No,
The distinction between the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian empires were all extremely diverse. So I think that I definitely sympathize with the superficiality of a lot of decolonial discourse these days, but a rejection of decoloniality or post-coloniality on the basis of a kind of straw man presentation of empires.
I think that you did misunderstood me, to be honest, because I never said that Russian Empire is not classical empire. It's classical horizontal empire. I'm talking about the Soviet Union. And I am not against application of the colonial approach. I'm just trying to say that this decolonial approach has to be tuned. You know, talking about classical empire, okay, let's take example of Russian Empire or British Empire. Yeah, British Empire was not putting monuments to Shakespeare in Bhopal, in Sudan, etc., etc. It was not modeling culture for Sudanese, which had to be franchise of the British cultural system. Because, again, we have to, it's a different topic, very important, it's the cultural models. Because I fully believe that Soviet cultural model was a franchise model. It's a repetition of the same cultures where it has to be national bard, like Pushkin in Russia, Shevchenko in Ukraine. If you don't have national bard, the situation is so bad. Okay, you have national epic poem, so it will be Manas for Kyrgyzstan or something like this. But difference to classical colonialism is also that, let's say, Tory party did not have Bombay branch, which was deciding who will be the next prime minister of Great Britain. And Donetsk mafia or Donetsk family were often, or Dnipropetrovsk, I'm sorry, Dnipropetrovsk was taking such a decision. So it's a different system. It's not making it better. It just needs a bit more, you know, tuned approach. I'm for usage of let's say post-colonial approach, but I think that this approach has to be balanced and has not to be reduced to repeating of holy word decolonization. Has to be a bit more to content. Like what I was describing to you in this Soviet cultural model or late Stalinist cultural model. Like usage of this 19th century interpretation of Russian art as a cultural model which had to be implemented on the whole territory of the Soviet Union.
I have a question from Ursula.
Thank you for that amazing presentation. So a big question, which I realise I'd now like to understand, and you're the person to answer it, if anyone can, I think. Can you give us, is this audible?
Yes.
Can you give us a sense of the evolution of public intellectual discourse about art fates in Ukraine over the last couple of decades?
You know, the question is that there is not too much of evolution. There is not too much of evolution of this discourse, unfortunately. Yeah, because I think that there are people who understand this. There are some museum officials, not all of them, who are very careful and understanding this. Unfortunately, we never produced during the independence period any serious
And second, then I've got a tiny little remark on the, you flashed past that fake. The bottom of it had a portrait cut out of a picture of Picasso watching a ball.
I don't, it was not a fake, it was.
Yeah.
It's very, because I can tell you why.
Yeah.
And you will understand because we already exchanged with you letters about this. Because, of course, post-war period, Soviet fascination with Picasso and Yermilov fascination with Picasso. Do you remember that museum monument to Picasso, which I was sending you picture, which is in the exhibition in Amherst. Yermilov feels himself like fully taken by Picasso, fascinated by Picasso, which is explained in this portrait here, and showing that it's created in the same time as a model for the museum.
So I knew you know that, but I do have a more serious question, which is that I believe I met you at the time of the Malevich exhibition in Amsterdam, which had a Russian catalogue, which someone gave me in Moscow. But did you? I went to the Malevich, very large Malevich exhibition with his perfume bottles in Moscow, which I believe was obviously in between 2014. It was much more recent. I don't know if it was like.
It was the recent. Which one? Do you remember where it was?
It was in the reconstruction of the Soviet pavilion.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you if you went to it, and bearing in mind the newer generation of what at the time I believed and respected as a new generation of art historical scholars who were serious and committed, to what extent they broached any Malevich questions in that very costly retrospective, which I do believe, on the other hand, didn't have a catalogue. So I wondered if you could answer that with.
Of course, I did not go to it because I did not go to Moscow after the last time I came there in capacity of U.S. official, and I was not recommended to go to Moscow after that, which I'm still keeping like good recommendation. Talking about Malevich exhibition in the reconstruction of the Рабочая колхозница scene, it had a parody in it. I will try to be very short because one of, let's say, advertisement element of this exhibition was that it's the first show which is demonstrating so-called portrait of Yakovleva, which is late Malevich work, work in the private collection in the Netherlands. So it was first time coming back home. It came back home, and a few years later, it was proved by Andrei Vasilyev, a researcher from St. Petersburg, that this portrait was painted by the pupil of Malevich, Jagubova, who, it's a tragic story because she lived with Yakovleva, they were a couple. Yakovleva died in her hands during the blockade. Jagubova, of course, died in the 70s, having no children, no heirs, etc. All her property was taken by the Soviet state and thrown into thrift stores. So this portrait of Yakovlev was sold for 12 rubles, and the price was dropping. After this, it was turned into Malevich. Malevich signature was added. It looks similar. It was smuggled to the West. It came through the chemical and analysis. Everything is okay except signature. It looks like Malevich style. And these people not only stole, tricked, faked, they stole the life of the artist. Because in addition to this, they came to the archives in St. Petersburg and stole and destroyed documents about the artist. So this is interesting fable which is connected to the exhibition of Malevich, which you saw in Moscow. I want to say one thing that I did not see because our main researchers of Malevich are out of Russia. Anyway, or there are those who in Russia are very old, and the problem for me is that, let's say, before the war, it was some young generation of relatively interesting Russian museum curators who finally tried to do something serious, like exhibition in Tretyakov Gallery on Museum of New Painterly Culture, like look at the provenances, etc., collaborated with Ukrainians too. What Putin did, it's erased. None of these people are in Moscow. All of them, like, it's like nuclear explosions, they're landing everywhere. All of this killed. This topic is not supported. One of Putin right-wingers, or I don't know, with right, left, what is applicable, in the State Duma said that Black Square of Malevich had to be removed from the Tretyakov gallery, that it's a disgrace. It's a person who is the head of so-called culture front of Russian Federation. Bodlaev, former actor who played in the funnily in Andrei Rublev by Tarkovsky. Yeah, so it's not a good time for Malevich. It's springtime for Putin, but not for Malevich. Yeah, so sadly.
Melina, if you can keep it short before. Thank you.
Well, I can, I think. I have a very brief comment about post-colonialism, neocolonialism. It's a very, so Spivak actually was in Lviv this May, and she gave a lecture on her essay, Kansas About and Speak, and then she was trying to explain to the Ukrainian audience that it was to say on pre-colonial India, not post-colonial essays. It's just a small anecdote. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, what do you think about Picasso in Parhomovka?
About Picasso?
In Parhomovka, yeah, and and the other, so the thing is, so Gorbachev actually was writing something about Yermilov in the 60s, and he published the correspondence about it with him in this one of the books. And from the correspondence, you can see that Yermilov actually sent something to Gorbachev.
No, Gorbachev, I have to tell you more. Gorbachev had a big part of Yermilov archive,
Yeah, so that's
which unfortunately he doesn't have anymore.
okay. Yeah, that was my question.
Because it's spread around this part of the world,
Okay. And
to put it nicely. Yeah, and of course you have to remember that Gorbachev was not only person who had access to Yermilov. Yeah, because we have Fogel archive and Fogel book, we have obviously Parnis serious work, because this catalog raisonné basically of Yermilov, which was published in conjunction with Yermilov exhibition, which was in Arsenal in Kyiv, and then in Moscow made. No, of course he had connections, he saw him, he had photographs, and now I have to find these photographs all around the globe, because they're popping up even near the place where I live in Budapest. I found a gallery which has this Yermilov, important Yermilov photographs, which we included in the exhibition in
And what do you think about Picasso in Parhomovka? Do you think it's...
You know, there are two versions. At first, I think that Picasso was making these doves like a machine. I like these doves drawing, like you remember, piece, not the main one, but repetition. So either maybe it was donated somewhere. It's not the major Picasso. Yeah, but I am not Picasso specialist. You better ask Sarah, who said the Picasso.
Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to panel. Which panel is this? Panel
Number 3.
Is it only panel 3?
Yes.
Surely it's like panel. There's been about 6 panels already. So the keynotes are not included in this panel. Okay, so welcome to panel 3 and the final panel of this extremely rich, exciting, and multifaceted conference, which I've learned a lot from and been very impressed by. Yes, so all I do is do institutional affiliations. Okay, so.
As well as your own. Who are you?
I'm the guy from the cafe, the Polish cafe across the road. I'm the resident Pole of this conference. My name is Michał Morawski. I'm Associate Professor of Critical Area Studies, whatever that means, in UCL, in the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. I'm an anthropologist of architecture, and I work on architecture and cities in Poland and Russia, and I suppose now I'm working on Russian destruction projects in Syria, Chechnya, and in Ukraine. And what I do is introduce the 3 speakers, and then we have a question and answer session at the end. At the very end, and we collect questions. So think of your questions as the speakers are speaking, please. So the first speaker is Dr. Yuri Shevchuk. who is Senior Lecturer in Ukrainian at the Department of Slavic Languages, Columbia University. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this fantastic conference. I'm really impressed, and it's very stimulating, and I will go back to New York with a lot to think about. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about Ukrainian modernist film and something of a revolution that it affected in what concerns the way Ukrainians were presented on the silver screen. And to give you a little bit of a context, I would like to start with what modernist does or did vis-a-vis the tradition. And in that sense, Ukrainian film not so much reinvented tradition or kind of researched it, as probably was the case with painting, sculpture, and other varieties of modernism, but rejected the tradition, at least in what concerns the stereotypes Ukrainians would be presented as in film. There is a kind of a truism that Ukrainian film history starts with the Russian Civil War with 1918, and that's despite the fact that before then there were made dozens of films that were inspired by Ukrainian literature, classical literature, that were made by Ukrainian talent, film directors, cameramen, Ukrainian actors, and they were made with the Ukrainian audience in mind primarily. And if we look at the body of those films, they kind of demonstrate certain important shared features. And one of them is the way they portray Ukrainians as in the kind of continuation of the philosophy of populism, of Narodnictvo. So the body of films, these common traits, where primarily the kind of Ukrainian, I give you some stereotypical kind of things, the mode of this representation came to be known as Narodnictvo, and this mode is about Ukrainians as happy, simple, dumb peasants, which could do no harm to the status quo. It fabricated and actively used a mask of burlesque and crude humor, a self-humiliating depiction of oneself meant to enhance the image of a vulgar, backward, dumb, unsophisticated, and ultimately innocuous peasant as the symbol of all things Ukrainian. Peasant is the key word in this mode of self-representation. This mode was nourished by the populist vision of Ukrainians as a peasant nation primarily, populated the countryside and deeply suspicious and alien to urban culture and the city. So populism was obsessed with the village culture and peasantry as the carrier of the, quote, true spirit and essence of the nation. It was hostile to urban culture. Now, populist self-representation in neo-Ukrainian films of this period is interesting in the fact that, it kind of showed an inclination for particular genres of films. And comedy was the most popular one. Then followed by historical drama, melodrama, horror, and myth. So when Ukrainian films started, the first Ukrainian films of the golden age of the 1920s starting being made, what happens is the rejection of this stereotype of Ukrainians as a primarily peasant, rural, folkloric, ethnographic identity belonging in the museum, and the discovery of the city, the kind of articulation of a new kind of image of Ukrainian as an urban character, and a kind of quick population of Ukrainian urban spaces happening on the screen. So the first such example of what is being done, this reinvention of Ukrainians as an urban identity, is the short comedy. It's 35 minutes long, called The Fruit of Love, Ягідка кохання in Ukrainian, shot by Dovzhenko in 2026. And the film basically changes the paradigm of Ukrainian self-representation and self-vision in a number of senses. Number one, it presents Ukrainian culture as urban, fashionable, modern, and attractive. Two, it colonizes the city, hitherto alien territory for Ukrainian culture, and populates it with recognizably Ukrainian characters. And three, it revises the very concept of comedy as the most popular genre in Ukrainian film and theater. So the protagonist of this film is called Jan Kubasnyuk. He is a city barber, a dandy, wearing a European suit, no embroidered shirt, no vyshyvanka, no sharovare. He wears a hat, a bow tie, flashy socks, and Dovzhenko kind of lingers. The camera shows his socks. They are very fashionable too. He plays the guitar, as opposed to Bandura. His family name, Sausage Maker, smacks of Kotlerevshchina, and brings to mind other tale-telling names so common in the pre-revolutionary Ukrainian silent movies. His first name is recognizably French, as if to announce a desire to be modern, cosmopolitan, and trendy, and probably brings to mind other such instances of playing with first names as Anatol Petritsky, as opposed to Anatoly, again sounding quaintly cosmopolitan, as Mikhail Semenko instead of Mikhailo Semenko, against this kind of play and hybridity, interestingly. The pairing of Jan and Kubasnyuk creates a comical dissonance between the cosmopolitan and the national specific. The hybridization of this anthroponym also broadcasts a healthy self-irony, a mark of growing cultural self-assertion of Ukrainians. So Dovzhenko visually appropriates the urban space. We see in the frame the elements of linguistics landscape, signs of institutions, and the film was, by the way, shot in Yalta, which was not part of Ukraine administered at that time. It was in Crimea, but Yalta is presented as a Ukrainian marked territory. Narodny Sud, Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, on the top of it, Ukrainska Socialistyczna Radянska Respublika. And the US see the linguistic landscape, street signs, names of institutions, etc., that are unmistakably Ukrainian and socialist. And what's also very important, that in this short, Dovzhenko gives Ukrainian comedy a new and decolonizing meaning. The Russian imperial view of Ukrainians got its distilled expression in Mykola Kulish's satirical comedy Mina Mazaylo. A character in that comedy, Russian chauvinist Totya Motya, Aunt Motya from the city of Kursk, famously says, "Are you in earnest or the Ukrainian way? Ви серйозно чи по-українському?" And that expresses the kind of attitude that was typical of Russians towards Ukrainians, that merely being Ukrainian is funny by definition. Ukrainians are funny. Their language is funny, and the very proposition that you are Ukrainian provokes a smirk. Dovzhenko's Ukrainians in The Fruit of Love are funny not because of who they are. As in any comedy, they get into all kinds of funny situations. That's why they are funny. By their appearance, Ukrainians in the film are indistinguishable from Europeans. You won't see like stupid, idiotic characters typical of Ukrainian comedy before 1917. Now, the same kind of, a similar kind of phenomenon of kind of colonizing Ukrainian cities by enhancing Ukrainian presence and kind of articulating this new Ukrainian socialist identity, we can see in three most important films of Zygavertov, the 11th, Man with a Movie Camera, and Enthusiasm, a Symphony of Donbass. All were shot in part as Man with a Movie Camera or entirely as the two others in Ukraine. All present a new urbanizing and industrializing Ukraine. Man with a Movie Camera shows 4 cities. 3 of them, Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Odessa, are in Ukraine, and Moscow is, you know where. The geographic locations shown in Man with a Movie Camera are both cinematic and linguistic. So, cinematic cues that Zygavertov offers are recognizable, iconic urban landscapes in Ukraine, like, for instance, this park bridge constructed in 1910, popularly known as the Mist Zakokhanev, the Lovers Bridge in Kyiv. We see Khreshchatyk, the main thoroughfare of Kyiv. There are also, importantly, linguistic cues that we see in the frame. Recognizable Ukrainian language signs of institutions, municipal services like the ambulance, bars, government documents, certificate of divorce, census form, wall newspaper called Filmar, the word that became obsolescent during the Soviet occupation is now coming back and becoming more popular and being used increasingly for filmmaker. We see Ukrainian words and terminology that later were replaced by the Russian equivalents, like Ukrainian for bachelor was parubok. Now nobody uses that word as bachelor, it's just a young man. We see it on the census form. Some inscriptions are evidence of the process of cultural decolonization of the urban space because they contain at the same time Ukrainian and Russian signs. And Ukrainian city dwellers in Man with a Movie Camera, with the exception of one brief frame, the people we see in the Man with a Movie Camera have no immediately recognizable ethnocultural traits about them, like embroidered shirts, baggy pants, drooping mustache, and etc. They look and make the cities they are shown in look urban and European. The city becomes a reflection of them, and they become a reflection of the city. In the absence of language spoken on the screen, they can be taken both as Ukrainian and Russian. They are presented more plausibly as a national. This is the Soviet people. So, one particularly interesting exemplar of how this new identity of Ukrainian was created on screen is Dovzhenko's film Ivan, and Ukraine's first talking film. So Ivan, Dovzhenko wanted, as a matter of program, insisted on making Ivan a Ukrainian language film. The pressure was exerted on him when it became known that that was his preference, his choice of language, to make it Russian. And the way it is documented in George Lieber's book on Dovzhenko, he came up with this almost laughable theory that he would love to make this film in Russian, but he can't find actors in Ukraine who speak fluent Russian. If you listen carefully to the film, almost all of them speak Ukrainian with Russian inflection, akaючи and stuff like that. That's why it's so funny. But Dovzhenko wanted the film to be Ukrainian. So what is so interesting about the film that we see all these dozens and hundreds of yesterday peasants joining the construction of Dnipro-Stan, the huge Ukrainian Soviet hydropower station of the Dnipro River, in the process of transforming from peasants to workers, village transforming into the city. And as they do that, Dovzhenko also makes Ukrainian the language of choice for this film, from the language of peasants to the language of this utopian, in the sense that it did not exist in reality, new Ukraine, where Ukrainian is the language of all walks of life. Workers, construction workers, communist functionaries of the highest level, university professors and university students. At that time, that kind of vision and proposition was truly revolutionary. As if it was, he wasn't bothered by the fact that in the reality of things, that was not the case. The Ukrainian was still very much limited. We were kind of at the end of the indigenization kind of campaign that had kind of had not been particularly successful, and it was already being rolled back. And what Dovzhenko does is he is turning the table on the imperial Russian culture and presents Ukrainian in the film as the language associated with social progress, with the future, with solidarity, social solidarity, because everybody speaks it, whereas Russian comes across as the language of reaction, bourgeois narrow-mindedness, and the language of the past. That is an unthinkable thing to do. And this becomes very kind of obvious in one scene. It's something like 61st minute of the film. There's a scene when a woman who speaks Russian and a man, Vova, who speaks Ukrainian, both listen to the radio. And the woman demands, Vova, za granicу, please tune to foreign music, to foreign jazz. And Vova, being a Ukrainian, tries to have it both ways, says, a little bit za granicу, a little bit our. And she doesn't buy it. She says za granicу and period. Finally, Vova has had enough of her, particularly when she says, what's with this radio craze, obsession? That's unacceptable to have radio in every city. And she says it's all in Russian, and Vova kind of retorts, in every city, we will do it in every village. We will cover every village with radio. And in this particular scene, Ukrainian is getting associated with progress, and Russian, again, in a very unlikely kind of way, comes across, it sounds like the symbol of Ukraine, of the past of bourgeois narrow-mindedness. So what is being done? Dovzhenko really exchanges, he redistributes the kind of symbolic capital between the culture of the colonized Ukrainian culture, giving it, elevating it, and kind of drops and demotes the imperial culture. As if to amplify the newly created prestige of Ukrainian culture, the radio in this scene broadcasts in Ukrainian. There's the shout out from Kharkiv tractor building plant to the listeners, and that makes Vova particularly like brimming with pride. So creating a vision of a new urban and modernizing Ukraine. These are the images of Ukrainians that you see in Ivan. Interestingly enough, the protagonist, Ivan, this guy, he wears a kind of nationally not specific shirt, but underneath you can still see the embroidery. It's almost like the symbol of transition from one identity, the kind of stereotypical colonial one, reductive to only ethnographic, to folkloric, to the museum-like, backward-looking, into a national one, the identity that is associated with the future, with social progress. So Ukrainian film becomes a powerful means to modernize the Ukrainian language, the central feature of Ukrainian identity. The association of Ukrainian with movies boosts the prestige and social value of the language that has been relentlessly repressed, ridiculed, and erased from public life up until then, meaning 1923. Movies like take Ukrainian out of the rural ghetto and flood the urban space with it. That was only recently totally dominated by Russian. Ukrainian starts being seen in intertitles everywhere silent movies were exhibited. With the arrival of the talking cinema, it started being heard by millions, especially in the context of rapidly expanding network of film projecting facilities. Viewers in the rest of the Soviet Union for the first time discover Ukraine as a linguistic landscape clearly delimited from Russia by street signs, names, institutions, and other graphic markers visible in the frame. One more thing that is important is the literal explosion of the variety of film genres that marks this period. There were only 4 film genres before 1917. Now you can see the list of them, and with some examples, this is also something very, very important. So in the 1920s and early 1930s, Ukrainian culture saw the emergence of its modernist cinema with such distinguishing marks as experimentation, montage, revision, rejection, and reinvention of tradition. This was accompanied by a historic shift of filmic topoi from the village to the city. Ukrainian modernist cinema offers a new paradigm-changing image of Ukraine as modern, progressive, and forward-looking nation. In a dramatic rupture with the tradition of folkloric self-representation, Kotlerevщина, Ukrainian modernist film colonizes the city, the territory hitherto unknown and alien to it. It transforms the Ukrainian movie character from a peasant into a worker, a city dweller, and a builder of a new social order. Urbanizing Ukrainian identity, the cinema at the same time endows it with its own historical subjectivity, political agency, and its authentic voice in the Ukrainian language. Modernist Ukrainian cinema becomes an instrument of decolonization. I know we love this. An articulation of a new post-colonial identity. Post-colonial identity, like literature of the period, it was also a means of an increasing Ukrainian cultural self-assertion. Ukrainian identity is presented on the silver screen as independent from Russian and self-sufficient. Ukrainian Soviet film of the 1920s and early 30s facilitated the wider process of modernization of the Ukrainian language and identity. There is no overestimating the historic and precedent-setting significance of the fact that Ukrainian sounds in the first talking movie, Dovzhenko's Ivan. Dovzhenko uses the expressive power of film to create a utopia, a Ukraine that is united by the shared aim of constructing a new social order, but most importantly, by one shared language. The Holodomor, the genocide that started in 1929 with the methodical destruction of Ukraine's cultural elite, including filmmakers such as Faust Lopatynsky, Mykola Nademsky, Dovzhenko was murdered as a creative person, not physically, as the same can be related to Kavaleridze, and peaked into a murder by famine of millions of peasants and the mass resettlement of Russians into Ukraine, put an end to this cinematic modernization. Ukrainian film was made to revert to the colonial mode of Kotlerevщина and provincialism, Cinematic Ukraine recedes from the urban spaces back into the village. Ukrainian cities like Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and others are repopulated with Russian characters. Spring on Zarechna Ulitsa is my favorite example of that. The entire body of works by Kira Muratova, Roman Balayan, Oleg Fialko, Alexander Shapiro do that. They show Ukraine without Ukrainians in the frame. Cinematic Ukraine shrinks to a small region around the Carpathian Mountains. The momentum of Russification created by the Holodomor is felt even today, as many Ukrainian filmmakers continue to use modes of representation that are colonialist. Natalia Vorozhbit, the writer and the director, and also director Artem Seitablayev, and the director Volodymyr Zelensky as well. Thank you. Now questions?
No, at the end. Thank you. Really, did you leave something? Thank you. You wanted to show the pre-ultimate.
No, don't worry.
Okay, and thank you for sustaining the momentum of provocative conclusions. Tradition at this conference. Next we have Dan Dubovitz, who is reader in architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture at Manchester Metropolitan University, and a photographer, and a distinguished photographer as well, we must not forget.
This talk introduces the work of an unknown Hungarian architect. It focuses entirely on just one modernist architectural design proposal for a monument to Taras Shevchenko in Kharkiv, produced in 1930, that was never built. The quest to discover and make sense of disparate fragments of the lost work, the lost biography of Stefan Šebek, and to try to understand the trajectory of a career speaks to a historiography that is particularly pertinent to the kaleidoscope of investigations that are being explored throughout this conference. Sitting in Berlin at the height of the international avant-garde in the late 1920s, a young Hungarian architect was working out his next career move. Stefan Šebek had just spent the first 3 years of his career, straight out of college, moving between the Bauhaus, Dessau, and Berlin. He had collaborated with Moholy Nagy to build the light module, to co-design the kinetic theatre, and to co-produce era-defining set designs for Owen Piscator in Berlin. And most notably, he'd just co-designed the Total Theatre with Walter Gropius. National Socialism was rising all around him in Germany. While his colleagues were making overtures to leave the Weimar Republic for the West, Šebek was working through some questions. What kind of modernist do I want to be, and where? His designs for revolving instruments projected an open and contextualized modernism, centered on the change they could make for society. This was setting his work apart and on a different trajectory to his contemporaries. What if he went east instead of west? To do this, he needed a solo project as his calling card, one that clearly articulated his proposition for architecture as an instrument of change. It was in this context that an international competition, the first of its kind, piqued his interest. The Committee for the Promotion of Construction in Kharkiv, wanted to attract international artists and artists to design 2 culturally significant projects. Competition brief on the left, the first one to be issued, was for a monument to poet Taras Shevchenko, and the one on the right was for a mass musical theatre. These international design competitions were launched in 1930 for Kharkiv. They were the forerunners of the most famous international competition of the era for the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow. The Kharkiv Theatre project attracted 99 international proposals out of the 144 proposals from 11 different countries, and really some of the most famous modernists practicing in that day. The first of these international competitions, however, lesser known, and I'm yet to find the published results from it, invited designs for a modern and contemporary monument to the Ukrainian national poet Taras Shevchenko to be built in Kharkiv. Looking like a steel spaceship landing from the future in the middle of a Kharkiv square, Stefan Shebek's monument to Shevchenko in 1930 looked like no memorial anyone had seen before. There is no figurative sculpture of Shevchenko on a plinth. In the words of my colleagues, it's all plinth. It was a proposal for a structure with living people as the figures. One that would contribute to everyday life, broadcasting images and audio from its 3 giant back projection screens and speakers. Not only did it look like it came from the future, it was built to accommodate it. One of the lines in the text for this project says, live moving pictures with sound. To be back projected in the thick of everyday life, in the bustling heart of Kharkiv. Technology that had not yet been invented. Shebek's design did not win the competition. It was never built. And his proposal for Kharkiv was unknown and lost for well over 50 years, in spite of cutting-edge modernist brief calling on a global community to design a contemporary monument in 1930. You got this. What was unveiled in Kharkiv on the 24th of March 1936 as a result of this competition was a gargantuan static figure of Shevchenko atop the mother of all plinths, flanked by sculpted freedom fighters and set in an open site at the edge of the city to create the set piece for choreographing armies and rallies. The international brief, the rejected and lost modernist monument proposal, the social realist monument that was actually built instead, seen side by side for the first time, reveals this cusp moment exquisitely. There are 2 dissonant visions of the future coexisting side by side here. The debate between modernism and social realism is a well-known story. We've been talking about it the last 2 days. But what's rare is an opportunity to explore a newly discovered and unhistoricized exemplar. Shebek's Shevchenko monument, seen in context of his other projects, which is in the larger paper, wait for the book, highlights how Ukraine was centre stage internationally for the creative development of modernism in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The competition entry speaks to the crossroads between modernism and historicism, right there in 1929 to 30. Would socialism be a traditional, realist, historicist project, looking to the past and pinning things down? Or would the socialist project be a modern, abstract future-facing project that opens up to an unknown future? In 1928 to 31, this debate between these 2 dissonant approaches was still wide open and very much alive. So, this paper sets out Stefan Shebek's proposal for a new and contemporary monument in his own words. When we move into the next section, it's not me speaking. You see it through his models, his drawings, his photo montage and collages. What I do at the end of that is then reflect on what alternative vision of modernism in the future this hardly known project might have offered if it had been built in Kharkiv in 1931. So firstly the competition, then the text, then the project. So this is, I don't know how to pronounce it, Adolf Strakov, someone help me with that, designed this. Now he's really known for something quite different to this, but it's an absolute exemplar of constructivist graphic design. In 1930, the Committee for the Promotion of Construction of Kharkiv, the District Executive Committee and Kharkiv Council announced with the publication of this book in 4 languages an international competition to design, and I quote, a memorial to the poet revolutionary Shevchenko as a fighter for the social and national liberation of Ukraine. Another quote, the monument must be a current and contemporary work of art. The designer of the project is warned against the stereotypical treatment of the monument. I'm not going to talk about Strakov now. So, Stefan Šebek's design of a monument for Shevchenko would have remained entirely lost and forgotten if it wasn't for the discovery of this. Okay, take a phone out. It's a quarter the size of a phone. If you've got it in your hands, it is that big. It folds out to 21 pages. It's a Leporello book, handmade by Stefan as a gift to Walter Gropius. It's the exact date there, the 1st of November 1930.
Can you go back to the previous, to the
Can you,
open?
You show it again.
yes, please.
I will show it again.
More. People demand more.
But the text is on the next page, so let me read this one. Just in case I didn't cover it, I'm going to just read it out. Stefan Šebek's design for a monument for Shevchenko would have remained like that. This curious handmade miniature book, 4.5 centimetres by 7, was discovered in the Bauhaus archive in Berlin. Not sure when, but the paper that you saw by accident before, by Gassner, was about 1993. That's the first writing up of it. And then Karen Wilhelm writes about it as well after that. Šebek had made it as a gift for Walter Gropius in November 1930, on the eve of his emigration with his new Ukrainian fiancée to Moscow. There you go. Unfolds 21 pages. The image of this, and this is really interesting to know why I've been able to find out so much about it. Each of these is a contact print. That's where you take the negative, put it against a piece of photographic paper. So there's no enlarger, so you don't lose any quality. It doesn't go through a lens. And as a result, it's incredibly sharp. But right up until 2 weeks ago, the only way of reading the text had been a really bad translation by a couple of people helped. It was Erwin Nagy, Holly's brother and his son, and Catherine Cook had a go at it as well. But they couldn't read it, you know, and we're working from bad photographs and whatever.
Is it in Hungarian or in?
It's in 4 languages. Well, this is it's definitely in Russian and German and French, I think. When we get to the picture of that, that's in quite good quality now. I've got decent scans out of Bauhaus before they stuck it in the basement. So, but, okay, let's just go through it. But I got really lucky. So Alfred Cruella had helped Stefan write the text, because he couldn't write very well in German, because he was Hungarian, let alone Ukrainian or Russian. So in Alfred's archive is a draft of this. It's not the same as what's in the final thing, and it's got mistakes in it because they're still working it out. But I have got a really poor translation of this, but that's what I'm about to read you. It's 4 pages of it, and you can see that it's actually set out on the page. It doesn't quite look like that in the Leporello, but it's there working out, which is a really nice document to have as well. And that's what I'm reading from, mostly. Okay? So I just wanted you to know. And it's as if they're scripting an agitprop performance, the way they're writing on the page. That's really nice. So I'm going to move into his words quite soon. In the proposal, quite some space is given to collages which mock current monuments and highlight what they perform. And there's like 5 of the pages are given over to this, and they're actually really quite funny. I'm just going to read these 2 quotes out now. I'll try and so the emphasis is his, so he puts certain things in capitals in the text. The monument, in the old sense, is based on an idealistic conception of society. It aims at the unification of absolute ideas and their creators. It celebrates the hero as the great unique individual. Thousands of monuments of this kind deface the squares and carry out idealistic, individualistic propaganda. This is to be rejected in the strictest possible way for a current and contemporary monument. Okay, we get the point. Now he describes it as there's a bit of repetition, and that's possibly because they were trying to work out what to say. But I put both versions in because it's all lovely. The The design is made up of a speaker's platform, in brackets, or stage for agitprop troops, projection screens and a loudspeaker system, in brackets, for agitprop troops, and cinema and radio. The construction of this monument is intended to be in close connection with revolutionary demonstrations, crucially here, but also within the framework of everyday life on the streets. The memorial destroys the, still his words, the memorial destroys the idea of Shevchenko with which the viewer came to it. It creates a new, obvious, impressive, this is not modest, is it? It creates a new, obvious, impressive presentation. It leaves him amazed, instructed, activated. And the viewer himself set all of this in motion. Languages in answer to you. So what have we got here? French, German, I assume Russian and Ukrainian. And somebody will tell me where this is at some point, because I'm still trying to work it out. A mobile monument that is open to the masses, can be activated by anyone, and changes and grows over time. And I'm going to repeat what he had on the last one. Within the framework of everyday life on the street. So this is it here, the triangle. And you can see by putting it there, there's 4 different ways of circumnavigating it. So it would have been really busy and bustling where he cited it. But you're going to see a collage in a minute. Schemes of the function of such a memorial in the street engages individual or group walking observers. It opens up to him. It offers itself to him. It challenges him with images, slogans, quotes, music, speech, favourite, advice. Bring it on. The particularly contradictory task of a current and contemporary Shevchenko memorial can only be solved by a dynamic, active, activatable, appealing to the masses, organising, switching memorial. I'm going to unpack switching at some point. I'm really interested in that, as he uses plastic somewhere else as well. This is a bit of a repeat, so I just, well, I'll do it. All right. The mobile, open, activatable, changeable, mass close, and actively organising monument needs cooperation of all arts, so it's multidisciplinary as well. Okay, we're coming to the end of the description of the monument. Today, I'm quoting, today, arrangement for silent films. Tomorrow, sound films, 1932 by the sound of it. The day after tomorrow, distant, colour, sound films. I haven't got a word for TV yet, have they? Okay, 5 minutes, I see. The monument is erected in 1931 with the technical means available at the time. After 10 years, these means are old and ridiculous. I am at conclusion. An instrument of perpetual revolution, reflecting on the historiographical process. The research has been undertaken in 2 distinct stages. Stage 1 was a research for a lost architect carried out largely by my mother with my collaboration from 1992 to 2016. She was his niece, which makes him my uncle as well. Stage 2, a component of which was presented here, was framed by a close reading of a 100, I'm going to flick to that image, of a 144-page FSB interrogation conducted over a year between 1940 and 41. This is the book that my mother did. Which lists all of the works that were confiscated and destroyed and will never likely be found. In other words, you know how much we don't have. And that's my starting point, is to know that there's a whole sea of work out there that we will never find. I have taken an archipelagic approach to this investigation, allowing all these surviving fragments of a career to present themselves as islands floating in an unfathomable sea, to allow them to be in flux. This has allowed me to shift the focus of my historical practice from gathering, that characterised the first stage, to discovery, and to centre my work on making connections and to establish a matrix that makes sense of what Stefan was trying to do, to try and define the arc of a career. This has led me to reflect on what kind of modernism Stefan is proposing for Kharkiv in 1930. And all of these terms, utopian and pragmatic at the same time, engaged, situated, relational, entangled, yet from the future, ephemeral, temporal, activating, open. You don't hear modernists talk about open. This differs markedly from the white space tabula rasa of his foremost collaborators at the time. The drawings he was doing for Walter Gropius showed a building set on a white tabula rasa. The drawings he did together with Moholy Nagy set buildings and objects in white space. Stefan's own work is different. So to the Constantine question, which you put to Polina, I really like this one. What's my personal take on all this? My matter of concern across a larger urban practice, as well as my historian practice, is how do we take more or better care in making tomorrow's cities? And a part of this is, of course, exploring how we take more or better care in historical practices. Today, as Stefan did nearly 100 years ago, I'm sitting on the edge of my bed, metaphorically, but yeah, asking, what can I, as a creative practitioner, do? What can I propose with my work when facing down rising empire, tyranny, migration, inequality all around me? I'm also asking, where's my avant-garde? I also see this work as a collaboration with Stefan, and the work is framed by a series of questions, one of which is, what would Stefan say? So, the second answer to your question. Stefan would maybe say that Kharkiv marked the opening of a new love affair. He and Gropius sought out a Ukrainian to help with the context and language for the theatre competition for Kharkiv they did together after the Shevchenko project. Stefan fell in love with Maria Levin, and together they went to Moscow to start a new life in 1931 and produce a daughter. Here he is in Berlin, in the middle, photographed by Gyula Pat. No, that's the photograph on the left. Sorry, by Gyula Pat, and below with his new Ukrainian family on a visit to Kiev. Last line. I see in Stefan's work someone creating projects that challenge the world around him to imagine alternative futures through his speculative design. His ideas for Kharkiv propose a monument that does not monumentalize its dead poet, but instead proposes a machine for exploring Shevchenko's spirit and intentions. This is an ephemeral proposal and should be replaced after 10 years. It proposes constructing an open architecture, one that changes. An architecture whose purpose and program comes to be shaped by the different people who come to activate it. Stefan's proposal goes beyond the object itself. He is proposing a fundamental repurposing of architecture. Its purpose should be to activate change on an ongoing basis. An architecture that constructs not just change, but a state of change. This monument design is a love letter to Kharkiv, proposing an instrument of perpetual revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for this fantastic presentation. I've seen a version of this presentation before, so I was less shocked than some people, but nevertheless, it shocks every time. So it is permanently shocking material, perpetually shocking material. What's the difference between perpetual and permanent? So next, the archipelagic metaphor I think is very nice. Maybe we can think about that too. Next and final speaker of I suppose the whole conference, although you will have some afterwards too. Okay. Is Christina Crawford, who is the Master Martin National Endowment of Humanities Professor of Art History and Associate Professor of Architectural History at Emory University.
If you're familiar with the architecture of early Soviet Kharkiv, the works you likely know are the constructivist avant-garde masterpieces like the Держпром, or maybe the Central Post Office here. Both of these sets of photographs are from the Korthal's collection, in fact. and they were taken by the English travel writer and photographer Robert Byron. But while these buildings did place Kharkiv into the modernist architectural conversation in the 1920s, I'd like to argue that it's the sublime industrial architecture, like neo-imperialist, which we've heard about today, and in fact the Kharkiv tractor factory, which we have also heard spoken of today, that it's these projects that most intensely entangled all of Eastern Ukraine in a transnational architectural discourse. So for you here, I'd like to lay the foundation for a historiographic recentering of Eastern Ukraine as a key international site of architectural and engineering experimentation. In the 1920s and 30s, during the first 5-year plan for industrialization, a map of which I'm showing you here, Soviet authorities invested heavily in capital projects throughout Eastern Ukraine, a territory rich in natural commodities. The region's massive industrial construction projects became busy sites of international design exchange, drawing experts from the United States, Germany, Czech Republic, and other nations to assist Soviet specialists in harnessing Ukraine's economic potential. Ukrainian historians have published widely on the architecture of Soviet Ukraine and about the Kharkiv tractor factory specifically, a project that will be the main example for this talk. And I mentioned their work at the outset to acknowledge first my own non-Ukrainian positionality, and my pledge to act always as a scholarly ally, lifting up and building on the research undertaken by Ukrainian colleagues that I'm sharing here. So one of the conference's prompts was, what intercultural and transnational encounters inform the development of modern art or architecture in Ukraine? And I would formulate the question, flipping it a bit. What intercultural and transnational encounters in Ukraine inform the development of modern architecture? So what I'll share here is an amalgamation of research that I've conducted for these 2 books. So the base research is not new, and some of you may have heard parts of this before, so I apologize. But the precise argument about the crucial role of Eastern Ukraine in the development of modern industrial architecture writ large is an argument that I haven't made in writing. So I'm sort of trying it on you as a result of Masha and Katya's prompt. So to begin, as you know, Kharkiv was the capital of Soviet Ukraine from 1922 to 1934. And this was a clear economic choice. Going back to the 1880s, Kharkiv was the logistics center of mining in the eastern region and the control center of the Southern Railway. The city stood to play an even more significant role in the early Soviet period as the transit and administrative center of the Donetsk industrial basin in the Donbass. In its 12 years as capital, Kharkiv proved an excellent site to test socialist space-making and iconography. The city had an expanded political role, obviously, and its population and industry increased precipitously. So this 1932 chart, one of my favorite finds, it plots 12 categories of growth in the city from 1913 to 1932, and then it projects their continued rise into the late 1940s. So I look at this chart as an architect, and what I see is building. So construction of new governmental buildings, housing, hospitals, schools, and all sorts of modern infrastructure was needed. Early Ukrainian Soviets, or Soviet-Ukrainian architectural production was inextricably tied to political conditions, like Capitol building. But I would like to argue it was even more tied to specific economic conditions. During Kharkiv's capital years, the Soviet Union passed, in fact, 3 economic periods. The New Economic Policy, or NEP, so-called state capitalism, and then the first and the second 5-year plans. The first being the hyper-industrialization drive of a reconsolidated socialist economy. During the first 5-year plan, the Soviet government pumped massive state funding into industrial projects to catch up and overtake capitalism. So each icon on this projective, again, this is kind of a wish image. This is not necessarily what happened. This is what they wanted to happen. But each of these icons is a new or existing industrial site slated to be constructed or expanded during the plan. It's an absolutely enormous and absurd undertaking. And there are only 3 sites that merited inset maps at a larger scale: Leningrad, Moscow, and the Donetsk Basin, underscoring the importance of the region to the Soviet industrialization drive. Now, equally important as the mineral resources in the Donbass was the grain that was harvested just beyond Kharkiv's borders and that was sold on international markets to fund these heavy industrial projects. So the grain and the industry cannot be extracted from one another. And as we know, since 2014, Russia has focused its aggression most intently in eastern Ukraine, not only because of its proximity to the Russian border, but of course because of the incredible density of resources in Donbass that hold a special place in the Russian imaginary. Propaganda from the first 5-year plan often highlighted industrializing projects in southern and eastern Ukraine as key to the success of the Soviet industrialization effort. But the ambitious timetable set for the first 5-year plan, set by Soviet economic planners, did not allow for a period of internal research and development. Industrial architecture was already well established in the United States by that time, however. So after the October 1929 global stock market crash, economic collapse in the capitalist world conspired to lock American and Soviet industry together mutually and beneficially. So what I'm showing you here is the indices of industrial production between 1929 and 1931. On the right, it should be very clear what's going on here. The USSR in the red is on the rise. The United States is in free fall in blue. So the Soviet government took advantage of near stoppage of US industrial development to draw American assistance on first 5-year plan projects. Here is American engineer Colonel Hugh Cooper, who used his dam design and building expertise at Nepryath. And although a precise number is difficult to establish, there were likely around 2,000 American technical consultants working for the Soviet government between 1928 and 1933, and many were in eastern Ukraine. So to kind of zoom into a single project to play this out. So we're going to take just a close look at the Kharkiv tractor factory, or Heteze, and its socialist city that highlights eastern Ukraine's central role in modernist architectural exchange and innovation. A late-breaking decision to construct this tractor factory on Kharkiv's outskirts pushed Soviet industrial planners and the project's architects to engage in international collaboration. The rapidly constructed factory was co-designed by American and Soviet architects and engineers. And it was based on a previous factory, but very cleverly adjusted to its context. So American architect Albert Kahn, who you see here signing the contract, he had in fact been contracted by the Soviet government to design a single tractor factory for Stalingrad. The project was a success and led to a 2-year agreement between the Soviet government and Albert Kahn, Inc., making the Detroit design firm consulting architects for all industrial construction in the USSR. During the time of Kahn's consultancy, Eastern Ukrainian industrial projects at the Azov metallurgical plant, or Azovstal, the machinery building plant at Kramatorsk, and the Kharkiv tractor factory were all designed and constructed. So, in November 1929, regional industrial planners selected Kharkiv as the site for a new tractor factory. Project preconditions included the guarantee of a 15-month construction period and full production of 50,000 tractors within 2 years' time. So this timeline, kind of working backwards, left just 7 months to prepare the drawings, prepare the site, and collect the labor pool for this, not only a factory, but also the residential settlement where all of the workers live. Now, miraculously, the factory was more or less completed on this breakneck schedule because of architectural standardization, but a very particular kind of Soviet-inflected standardization. Now the plan had been to copy Kahn's Stalingrad factory that you can see on the left, exactly for Kharkiv on the right, as that was the only way that they could meet the schedule. And you can see here, obviously, it's flipped 180 degrees, but it's the same plan. So the form, the dimensions of the plan are the same, but there were many alterations made, and including a very significant material change from steel to concrete. And it was Ukrainian architects and engineers, Fisenko was one, Kovalev was another one, who worked with American colleagues on site to enact this material switch. And this process by which a standard type is kind of tweaked to accommodate local conditions has a specific, there's a specific term in Ukrainian and Russian, which is privyaska, or architectural adjustment. And it allows for both speed in turning a drawing set around, but also specificity to the construction site. And it's exactly this process by which standardized mass housing was installed throughout the Soviet Union, of course, in the later period. But I argue that it starts here. So if we believe the propaganda, the American construction foreman on the Kharkiv tractor factory site, Leon Swagian, who you can see on the left, claimed that takich tempiev jak tu я не бачив, or such a tempo as this I have never seen before at KTZ. And here on the right, in the fedoras, and they're always in fedoras, that's how you know they're foreigners, these are Americans, Germans, Poles, Czechs, etc., who worked on the construction at KTZ. So the work site, as I'm trying to convey, was a veritable international village. But what's important on this Kharkiv industrial site is the emergence of an architectural process. So after this successful experiment, Soviet state design institutes absorbed these industrial typologies and architectural details and then carried them well into later decades through strategic adjustments from site to site. So the built result was a collection of industrial complexes strewn across the Soviet Union that resembled one another not like twins, but like siblings or brothers or sisters. And just as a quick aside, last year when I was on sabbatical, I taught the third-year urban history seminar at the Kharkiv School of Architecture. And I asked the students to conduct their own research and give a presentation on the Kharkiv tractor factory. None of them had ever been there. Or understood the importance of the site. I would say that now they do. The design for Stalingrad set up the design for Kharkiv, which extended, improved on its predecessor. This is a diagram by the student Sasha Podolsky. He got it. So the lessons of architectural standardization learned on the factory impacted the design of Soviet worker housing on the site as well, in the so-called socialist city or sotsmisto that was built adjacent to the factory. And so here's Kharkiv. You can see the sort of traditional concentric form of the city, long haul train line, and then this is the site that we'll be looking at right here. So the factory, which you can see on the top of this diagram, the residential area below, were designed by separate teams. While the factory project team was working to adjust the Stalingrad plans to this site, the sotsmisto project called New Kharkiv was assigned to Ukrainian architect Pavlo Alyoshin and a local team of young designers, many of whom were architecture students still in Kharkiv. Both Alyoshin and his students gleaned modernist architectural precepts both from foreign travel and research. But they adjusted, melded, and then exceeded, I would argue, these models. So Alyoshin, I don't have a photograph of him, but imagine. Born in Ukraine, graduated from the Institute for Civil Engineers in St. Petersburg. He had traveled extensively throughout Western Europe before the revolution. And he had a sort of just a remarkable, huge library of architectural texts in multiple languages and multiple geographies in his Kiev apartment, through which he became acquainted with both architectural history, contemporary trends, and including the modernist site planning that you see in evidence here, which is very similar, to, for instance, to what's happening in Neue Frankfurt by the architect Ernst May. But it's the distinctive form of the entire site plan, the sort of factory and the sotsmisto together, that mark it as one of the only constructed examples of the theoretical model known as the Soviet linear city. I'll go through this very quickly, but do you know this? No, okay. The linear city's main proponent, Nikolai Milyutin, wrote, and I'll just quote him, "A flowing, functional assembly line system is the absolutely necessary basis for the new planning. The residential sector of the settlement must be set up parallel to the productive zone and must be separated from it by a green belt or buffer zone. This protective strip must be no less than 500 meters wide." So what we're seeing here, the green zone acted as the kind of lungs of the project to filter any stray industrial particulates that might drift toward the residential zone, as if the wind, only and ever blew in this direction. But what's very smart about it, each worker had a short 10 to 20 minute walk to work from his residential unit to the factory. And then the green zone also structures this rational linear growth in either direction along its length while maintaining the optimal distance between them. And you can imagine this kind of linear growth always along a rail line. It's predicated on the linearity of the rail, snaking kind of throughout Soviet territories. So this is an early version of the socialist city site plan by Alyoshin's team, and it reveals this exact layering of program, flipped 180 degrees again, divided into parallel zones. So you see they have heavy rail to the north, then the factory, the production zone, exactly 500 meter green zone, and then these sort of cut and paste residential blocks, colonizing perhaps the countryside. And a sort of close look at the more contemporary area of New Kharkiv, of course before Russian bombing of the city and the site, shows that it was built as planned. The 5 linear zones down to an exactly 500 meter green zone are still legible in this urban fabric. Though as of 2018, developers have started to eat into the green zone. So the socialist city, or Sotsmisto, was the name of the entire residential area across from the factory. It was composed of these repeatable blocks known as living complexes, or жилкомплексы. You can see in this close-up that there are just 3 block designs in 5 blocks. They're mirrored about the center line right here. Limited number of housing, social service building types. Each of the жилкомплексы were to hold 2,500 residents. They had kindergarten, schools, workers' clubs, etc. And then the socialist city, or Sotsmisto, was the name for the entire composition to reach a population of between 25,000 and 50,000 total residents. This bird's eye perspective, quite a romantic one, I must say, shows the constituent elements of the housing combine. So dormitory type spaces in the tall buildings in the foreground, more sort of family units in the shorter buildings, and then the workers' club. This is where you eat and recreate right here, and these are the schools in the back of the blocks. These were plans of the tallest housing types. The individual units were called living cells, 6 square meters. And as the poster from Soviet Ukraine makes clear, life was to be lived in the public realm. You eat with your comrades in the canteen, you recreate in the workers' club, you extract coal, make tractors, period. And anecdotally, we know that these living cells were not popular. Walls were knocked down to make family apartments, hot plates were smuggled into the kitchenless units. But the social infrastructure was successful and it persisted throughout the Soviet era. And while the residential buildings here, maybe we'll just call them austere, the architecture of the social programming was quite exuberant. So the kindergartens, the workers' clubs were allowed to be architecturally idiosyncratic because it was their job to communicate kind of communality in the urban unit. Now I do, in my book, I largely paint the Kharkiv tractor factory as an architectural success story for the reasons that I've laid out here, mostly having to do with the sort of processes of standardization that move kind of from scale to scale. But of course, it's important to contextualize the historical era's violence. So we know that outside of the high brick wall that surrounded the factory, each entrance of which was guarded by a soldier with a loaded rifle and fixed bayonet, was manufactured famine and genocide, the Holodomor. And that's because the grain grown in the countryside was the primary Soviet export to fund capital projects like the Kharkiv tractor factory. The manufactured famine was precisely an effort to force the farmers, the peasantry, into compliance with Soviet agricultural collectivization to bankroll industrial expansion. So architecture, economy, politics, you can never unlink them. So to conclude, and to reiterate why early Soviet industrial projects in eastern Ukraine shift the center of architectural innovation, I'll discuss the implications, just very briefly, of design standardization on the continental scale. So the Soviets frequently noted that the USSR constituted a full 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. But that was only useful, that territory, if you could harness it. So the immense natural resources, the vast territories had to be reached and settled. And this task was one of the main drivers of the first five-year plan for industrialization. The plan was, I think you could say, an effort to take control of this landmass. So how do you quickly populate these dots on the map, these industrial settlements? Through standardized urban units like those developed at the Kharkiv tractor factory. And here in pages from Oksana Chaplanyuk's chapter in Detroit, Moscow, Detroit, you can see that the Sotsmesto et Dnipro on the upper right, two used limited architectural types to generate pop-up cities for industrial worker populations in this era. So eastern Ukraine was ground zero for industrial and residential architectural standardization on multiple sites. So to return in conclusion to this final question. What encounters in Ukraine informed the development of modern architecture? And I answer it speculatively this way, that people carry ideas and expertise, a point that so many of this conference's papers has underscored. So US technical consultants, for example, simply used what they had learned in the USSR without fanfare upon return to US projects, enacting a kind of reverse technology transfer. Now keep in mind that this was the era of the New Deal, which was America's state-sponsored construction effort intended to pull the US out of the Great Depression, a massive capital building project, not so unlike the first five-year plan. So American architects and engineers immediately implemented innovative construction tactics developed on challenging Soviet sites like Dnipro when they returned to work on large New Deal infrastructure projects like the TVA Pickwick Dam that you see on the right. One American engineer noted of the Soviet experience that, quote, if you want to know how to do the impossible, how to do something that can't be done, talk to some of those fellows who put the Soviet job over. So industrial projects like KTZ and Dnipro, well known internationally at the time, were not avant-garde one-offs like the Deshprom. Instead, they became repeatable models disseminated to sites within the USSR and beyond, to the New Deal United States, for instance, to cement Eastern Ukraine's role as a vector for modernist architectural design processes and forms. Thank you.
So should we invite all the three speakers to come to the table? Okay, that was. I'll get started. That was really absolutely wonderful. I feel like I have a lot of power to abuse here because I can see already that there's a number of questions that have been planted before the opportunity even has begun. But I'm going to abuse my power a little bit because I also can't help myself. I think. There's many. I think this archipelagic metaphor that you introduced is perhaps something that can unite these papers. But I'm going to ask a couple of things to each speaker, if that's okay. Dana, I have like a million questions for you, obviously. My two ones that I suppose, actually it's one question, one comment. In this monument, where is Shevchenko? Did he explain actually how Shevchenko is to be discovered by the viewer? Was there Shevchenko content actually in the monument? Or was in fact, so don't answer that now, answer that once I've asked all the other questions. So was Shevchenko there, or was actually he rather ignored? Did this radical perpetual motion accommodate actual, the figure of the poet, or the words of the poet? Since there's a lot of words in this book, is the poetry also there, or is it replaced by the architect's own poetry?
The other thing that's very interesting about Shobok, I suppose, is that he died in prison, right, in Moscow. So that makes him one of the relatively few architects that we know of to be killed by in the repressions. There were architects who were killed. Everyone knows about Okitovic. But we also know that architects had a kind of higher survival rate than members of many other professions. One other architect that I know of who was killed was Grzegorz Sugalny, who was a Polish architect who submitted a 1931 design for the first Palace of the Soviets competition together with Bertold Lubetkin, and stayed in Moscow and was killed in 1938 in the Polish operation of the NKVD. And his brother then became the chief architect of Warsaw, who built the Palace of Culture de facto. So there were, and maybe perhaps many foreign architects were more than we know were killed in the repression. So anyway, does the fact that he was repressed, killed, what's the role of that in his biography? Christina, I mean, also I suppose like there's so much in your paper to ask, but I suppose what you ended on, the role of the hunger and the Holodomor in this modernist project, and that's also one thing that makes architecture and infrastructure different to art, because we can ask or speculate on questions about whether or not Malevich was responding to Holodomor in his paintings, whereas architecture and infrastructure does not respond to, but actually not only facilitates but necessitates death and suffering in order. So it has a completely different relationship to modernist planning, architecture, and infrastructure has a radically different relationship to human suffering than other art forms. And Yuri as well, I mean, so much to ask. I wonder, this is also an interesting presentation of effectively the decolonization of which you spoke, of the decolonization of the city or of cinema, but still under Soviet auspices, right? So it's an example of some kind of decolonization which nevertheless took place within the context of the Soviet Union. And I'm also very interested in something maybe you insinuated or maybe I misunderstood, a kind of continuity between contemporary Ukrainian TV and film, in particular Kvartal 95 and Zelensky's own works, and kind of socialist realist cinema. Is Zelensky in fact a kind of zombie socialist realist filmmaker?
I start. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Is that working? Right. Yeah, I underreported on what he had in Shevchenko, and I also, in terms of representing it in the object, and I think I'll go back and get some better quotes for this. It's missing, sorry. He imagines multiple things, and they, to me, contradict each other a little bit. But on the one hand, at one point he talks about that theatre troupes would respond to his work and make new work. He talks about poets doing readings. Mm-hmm. So this lower stage is a stage which he describes as for theatre troupes, agitprop troupes. It sounds like a kind of town crier scream, with a big megaphone shouting at people as they walk past. So kind of how that would work. Mm-hmm. And obviously you've got back projection, so it's also imagining stills and film, and that multiple arts would come together to memorialize him or remember him as an ongoing process. Mm-hmm. But then the other side of that is, well, if it's an ongoing process and it's live and it's updated, then it's going to often depart from just reading out his material, but it's about making new material. It's very much inviting new material. So it's the idea is that you memorialize Shevchenko by being inspired by him and reenacting something fresh that's contemporary to you. And the other question was biography and death. I think maybe just a few details are really interesting rather than being able to answer your question. They've discovered a letter from he worked in Ginsberg's studio for the Vesna Brothers designing Moscow Underground, providing the technical solution, which is the technical solution for the Moscow Underground, in terms of how the tunnels are constructed. And so he was working for the State Railway, which meant his boss was Kaganovich, and he dies because he's on a Kaganovich death list. So there's the irony. So there's a letter from the Vesna brothers pleading to Kaganovich to not arrest him. So they get wind that he's going on not. In fact, they were trying to get him not to lose his apartment. He was about to lose his state apartment. So they risk their own lives in defending him which they knew the risk they were taking. That's how strongly they felt about him. But so he wasn't arrested at that point, but he was arrested later. I don't want to get into the interrogation here. It's pretty hard. So I'll stop there. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so the question of hunger. When I was kind of finishing the manuscript for the book, in which the Redress project figures heavily, I wasn't sure to what degree to bring that part of the story. Partly because it's the final of 3 sites, so I think Baku, Magnitogorsk, and Kharkiv is the sort of culmination. It's an architectural success story. So I wasn't. I had mixed feelings about bringing the Holodomor into that story. But one of the manuscript readers, this is one of the comments that they made. They said, "You cannot not tell the story of the Holodomor." And in fact, where I had found the best information about that was in memoirs from 2 Americans who had been on the Redress site. So a union organizer from the United States who sort of flees, a fellow traveler flees to the Soviet Union. He's put to work as a propagandist among the foreigners on Redress. And then the wife of an engineer, an American engineer who was on the site. And they both, in their memoirs from the 1930s, make very clear what's happening in the area around. So not on the Redress site itself, because it's within a brick wall. It's a sort of protected precinct. But the union organizer in particular, with Ukrainian friends, goes outside of the wall and he sees what's happening. Villages with no live people left in them. And then this prompted a bigger sort of question in my own mind, just about the economics of capital projects like these. And it was very, very clear that the money was coming from agriculture to feed industry, and that had to be part of the story. And of course, it's incredibly ironic that it's a tractor factory to be harvesting grain. That so it's a difficult story, but I'm glad that the reader told me that I needed to have it there. So.
But you're right that the tractor factory is particularly symptomatic and symbolic of that of that tragic economy, right?
Right, exactly. Right, making machines that the peasants will never use because they have died. Right, so.
Continuity. There is continuity in one aspect, and there is lack thereof in another. With the kind of rolling back of this modernist experiment of creating modernized urban Ukrainian identity as opposed to colonialist, reductive to only the ethnographic and folkloric one, the folkloric and ethnographic is taking over, and the kind of Kotlerevshchina presentation of Ukrainians as, by definition, funny, is becoming the case more and more practiced, so much so that the empire, the Soviet empire, collapses in 1991, but that mode of representation is well and alive and kicking up until today. Before I was, as I was packing for this conference, a director insisted that I watch his brand new comedy. It's called Dilo bez Piatovo, the case of the heelless one. Bezpiate is one of the euphemistic references to Satan. And it's an adaptation of Ukrainian classic 100,000, 100 tysięcy by Ivan Karpenko-Kary. And I just smiled, because that was Kotlerevshchina in its pure form. Everybody is an idiot there. And you are asked to laugh at these Ukrainians because they are idiots, not because they say funny things. So this kind of thing, there is a continuity there. There is no continuity in what concerns this fantastic modernist experiment done by Dovzhenko
and I didn't talk at all about what he does with urban modernist identity as opposed to peasant identity in his Venehora. There are two separate characters, Pavlo on the one hand, representing traditional Ukrainian religious, embroidered all in all, and there is Timis, who is a revolutionary, clad in leather, attractive, and kind of winking at you, follow me, I am the future. The same thing in Arsenal, when in the middle of the film, Timis, the same character, is asked, are you Ukrainian? And he, as if anticipating this traditional inherited understanding of Ukrainian, he says, no, I am a worker. He rejects it. In the final scene, when he rips his shirt apart and he's about to die and he's shot at, and he says, shoot, I am a Ukrainian worker. So that's a kind of a synthesis of both national and social in this in essentially urban character. So today, for instance, what Dovzhenko did with Ivan, showing that there is no narrative, there is no story that cannot be told on screen in the Ukrainian language, we hear in the press 3 years ago, a leading Ukrainian, very influential Ukrainian film producer in the interview saying, you can't make a film about Kyiv in Ukrainian because nobody will believe you. That's the colonialist. It's not even post-colonialist, it's deeply colonialist kind of understanding and lack of faith in culture, language, something that is absolutely winning about the 20s and the 30s. All those people were full of this belief that there's nothing impossible for them to, that they cannot do. Everybody wanted to be Ukrainian then. You look at the building Slovo and all this memorial plaque of people, like 80% of them killed. There are Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, Jewish, even Swedish family names there. Now there is this kind of lack of faith. People, I can talk about this, but
Okay, so I think definitely first question from Konstantin, and then second question.
Constance.
Yes, yeah. So you have the.
I have questions, comments to three speakers, and I want to start with Christina from the end to the beginning. Talking about Holodomor and construction, of course, you mentioned these memoirs of American experts, but there is such towering figure as Alexander Weinenberger, the Swedish chemical engineer. He was not in tractor factory, but was appointed director of chemical factory, situated not very far from the tractor factory. Who was he was from Vienna. He was Austro-fascist and later outright Nazi, and he created unbelievable photo record of the most important images of Holodomor, produced by him, and now in Vienna in the DZ's archive, and in a sense were then used by the Nazi propaganda for in anti-Soviet. But he was an engineer, and he would make these images. So these people were visible on the streets of Kharkiv. And the question is, all this industrial and modernist architecture, in the case of Kharkiv, I personally can recollect two Ukrainian architects involved in less important projects like ATS, telephone exchange by Frolov, and the building Slovo we just was mentioned. Everything else is constructed by architects sent from Moscow.
There's also the building of the party administration building on the.
Yeah, it's not party, it's industrial administration. You're talking about Держпром.
No, I'm not talking about Держпром, I'm talking about the building on the other side of the Freedom Square.
Which is reconstructed, but this is
yeah, but it's by a Ukrainian Jewish architect. I've forgotten his name, but that's also, not by a Russian architect, for sure.
Yeah, it's Jewish but not Ukrainian. There is no Ukrainian architects in the center of Kharkiv on big projects.
I think he was born in Kharkiv, according to Zhenya Gubkina's.
Okay, we can check it. There is no big projects. There is no big industrial projects.
Yeah.
Dniprostroi, we know Vesnin Brothers full participation. It's a grand. I cannot say word colonial anymore.
Well, I mean, one of the arguments that I'm trying to make too is that if we understand, I think, first of all, it's incorrect. I mean, I'm very fond of Pavlo Alyoshin, so I'll give him some credit. But these big industrial projects, you can't assign them to a single architect. Like, that's not.
No, but if they are not even in the groups because they don't have qualified architects.
Well, I mean, there were qualified architects and engineers. I mean, the engineers were doing a lot of work, and many of them were Ukrainian. So let's call them co-produced.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, the Dirshprom, is by Moscow architects more or less.
Moscow and Leningrad, etc. Talking about Kharkiv story, I think that one of the problem, it was a wrong time. It was too late, because it's really reminding all these constructivist, freestanding efforts made in Kharkiv, which of course were temporary architecture, but sometimes had the sound facilities, etc., etc. Of course, this Shevchenko monument, it's too late. And if it could be for, literally 5 years ago, it could be considered, I think.
It could be considered.
It could be considered. It was too late, because it's a time of construction of these things like Yermilov.
Can I come back to you on that? The brief itself says that it wants a new kind of monument, and it's written in a constructivist style. So still, the brief itself is putting out a call for a modernist. It did change, but my sense from the data that I'm getting around this particular project, and the same for the Kharkiv Theatre, is that they're asking in 1930 and 31 for a constructivist design, but by the time they select it a year later, so I don't feel like it's 5 years behind. I think it's actually
like one 6 months.
It's like one of the cusp moments when they set the project. The typology and the typography is constructivist. When they select the project, and I'm wondering if it was ever announced, because at this point, I haven't seen the results of it.
I can tell you that the Kharkiv is very interesting as a transitional ground.
Yeah.
Yesterday, Miroslava showed in her presentation this palace of a railway man, which started as a constructivist project. Unfortunately, destroyed by the Russian missiles, so you cannot see what is inside. By the end time, they are making interior. The mood changing. They commissioned huge painted, huge painting, wall paintings. No, not frescoes, but canvases, which are produced by Lanceray, a Russian artist connected with world of art. Absolutely realistic, absolutely different. So it's the moment of this freeze. You can see through the Kharkiv architecture, there are not too many radical things. This post office, which was shown, is a constructivist swan song of the architect, who after this becoming like very good Stalinist architect. So we can discuss this more.
This, by the way, is the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party.
But
which is a representation of the relationship between base and superstructure.
Yeah,
And the architect is Yakov Steinberg, who was born in Kiev.
But
Kiev,
and the building construction.
I think that's right. Okay, we've got.
I have still.
Very quick.
Very quick. Talking about Dovzhenko and this situation with Russian versus Ukrainian. It's in a sense ideal illustration of initial policy of Ukrainization, because if you remember Russization policy, it was two Russian languages, of old regime and of new regime. And the language of old regime had, like people from old regime, had to be removed by Russization policy. So in a sense, I think that he is playing a game, he is maintaining that what you told us. So we are doing this.
He is playing a dangerous game with his life, because Holodomor is normally reduced only to famine. But I said that it started in 1929 with the trial of the Spilka Wyzwolenia Ukrainy and the destruction of Ukrainian cultural elites and persecution, destruction of Ukrainian academy, Yefremov, the Mikhailo Hrushevsky, and all of them. The terror started already there, and he insists on making the film in Ukrainian. That didn't kind of dovetail with Ukrainianization. Ukrainianization was on the wave, and on the wane, and there is also now, lately, there's this theory that it was a ruse to simply identify people to be later killed. People who would go along with that flow will be carried away believing that they were sincere and kind of expose themselves, and then they were, what, 85% of whoever published anything got physically destroyed as a result of that.
So thank you, that's great. We have two questions. First question over here, second question, Sarah.
Thank you very much. It was really enlightening. A quick question for Dr. Crawford. In terms of transnational accountants, were the Lever brothers ever involved? Like I'm thinking Fort Sunlight, the 1888. It kind of echoes a lot of what they were doing then for Fort Sunlight.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I mean, these, both before the revolution and then after the revolution, then Soviet planners were looking very much at English garden cities, and they're looking at oil worker villages in the States, and so there was just an incredible transnational discussion, I guess you could say, both through travel and then also through publications. Looking at what are the proper ways to deal with worker housing in relationship to industry and housing and the like. So in another site that I write about, Baku, that architect had traveled to New Cape all around these sites. Yeah.
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to this cusp moment in Dan's talk and this switch, because you said that the translation that you found miraculously was in the Kurella archives of Alfred Kurella had typed out that German translation. Now, Kurella is a key figure in the Comintern, and I don't understand.
Comintern. Yes.
And I don't really understand why, in the exhibition even, the symbolic end is not emphasized more as the Comintern choosing Kharkov for the International Congress of Revolutionary Writers. This is when Louis Aragon, people from France and things, come to Kharkiv as a show city. Then, of course, the next competition, Boris Yeltsin gets the commission and so forth. It's this moment of switch. So the Kurella, I don't know where the Kurella archives are, I'd like to ask you, but I think Kurella being involved with this constructivist project before he switches is interesting. And in terms of actual things to do with colonialism and post-colonialism, Kurella then, in 1931, is in Paris organizing the anti-colonial surrealist exhibition and making this big manifesto saying, don't visit the colonial exhibition. And it took a long time to find out that he's behind it. But he is a very interesting mobile figure acting for the Comintern. And if the Comintern want him to actually get involved with anti-colonial activity, changing their goalposts, I think it's very interesting. And I just think he's a very interesting vector. But I'd also like to ask Konstantin why this Congress keeps consistently being left out, and without my language skills being sufficient, I can't actually do the research myself. I know that some of the explanation is in the BDIC, the French Bibliothèque de Documentation Internationale Contemporaine, but obviously there's a lot in in Moscow. So my big question is about this term, because I think it's absolutely crucial, and thank you for your paper.
I think it was a question more for Constantine than me about why it's left. I can tell you a little bit about Kurela, but I'll tell you afterwards. I only know a limited amount.
Yeah, talking about Kurela. Kurela played gigantic role in the Soviet Union in the 30s. Don't forget all the endless publication in Dayosh and in all other magazines. He's surviving the war, he's going to GDR, he's getting high position in GDR, all archives are in Germany, more or less safe. And I think that we just have to take an effort on Kurela, because it's extremely important for, let's say, the second constructivism of the Cultural Revolution. All these beautiful experiments of Kurela, of creating new interior. I just want to mention one, because we did not have production of beautiful modern furniture, so Kurela offered the idea to take decorated neoclassical chairs and just to cut out decoration, transforming them into constructive furniture, which was seriously done and tried. Yeah, so Kurela is like Kipyangris. It's extremely interesting story. Let's talk what it could be done about this.
Yeah, it's a nice avenue, thank you.
I think also, I think the,
Do you have a question?
yeah, just like a small comment that colonialism and imperialism is essentially in Marxist vocabulary. You know, it's sort of, especially in this time that there's this big project, like this time in the Soviet Union, this is an imagination of emancipating people from colonial oppression, and I think avant-garde also has this kind of. I think for me it's not surprising that they had anti-colonial exhibition, because it's also one that kind of left orientation. Yeah. So I think, but on the other hand, when you extend something in other areas, for example, in Ukraine, so I don't want to confuse something that is transnational cooperation, that was like interchange and exchange, and something that is more connected to occupying it, you know. So if you do some project, I mean, we are in London, but we are not colonizing London, you know, in a sense. We're doing something here. So I think it's very easy.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so I think this international favor of Coinciding don't like it, but avant-garde shouldn't be lost. Yeah, so this idea of cooperation and equality, yeah, between artists and different
One word.
Only two.
In Ukrainian literature of the 20s and in Russian literature, Russian colonialism, Russian imperial colonialism, constantly mentioned. It's a general trope. So during that time, they were talking about decolonization of Ukraine.
Any further questions? Yep. Two more, right? You have one too.
I have another question for Dr. Crawford. I'm very interested in you mentioned the idea of sublime industrial works in Ukraine. And I'm wondering if that is a documented idea, that if people describe works like that contemporaneously, or if it was imported by the American architects, or if that really wasn't turned on. And if it was, are there any other examples of architecture?
It's very simple. To the best of my knowledge, it's not indigenous to the time. It's more, I guess it's my term, and as applied to these sites. And you know, you can see it in Detroit. I mean, basically these enormous industrial installations are sublime because the scale is you just cannot get your head around how enormous. And I think the architectural standardization, the sort of repetition of forms leads to that kind of sense of sublimity as well. It's almost like, to the horizon and beyond. So this is just my term, and also a way to take this architecture seriously. Because typically the architecture of factories, this is changing a bit. A colleague, Claire Zimmerman, is publishing a book on Albert Kahn, who we met here, taking him seriously as an architect. But at any rate, it's to tip my hat, maybe say, to these architects and engineers.
I'd just like to add to that, because we did a piece on architecture and the sublime, and my colleague was just describing that something that's sublime is both incredibly seductive and beautiful, but also utterly terrifying. Explaining really digging into what that term's about, and actually, so when we look at these images of this, and then when you describe what the housing was like, and just the scale of the industry and what it all means today.
There's a lot of literature about the Stalinist sublime and the political sublime in Stalinism. I think Katerina Clark writes about it. Literature. Evgeny Heller or something writes about the political sublime in Stalinism, and I write about it too in my Palace Complex book. So yeah, but the term is used in the literature, but it's not a term from the materials. It's a term that has been, but it makes sense. And there's overproduction of numbers as well. There's statistics everywhere. So many numbers are so huge that you can't really comprehend what they mean. They're just supposed to inspire awe and terror.
Yeah.
And there's a question over there. We have 3 minutes left. So if you do have a question you're kind of wanting to ask, now is the time.
Hello, and thank you so much for the presentation. So I have a question for Dr. Shepshuk. So I was very interested in how you kind of frame the Ukrainian language as a very core part of how national identity was formed in modernist cinema in Ukraine. And I was wondering if maybe there were other ways of expressing that culture and national identity, maybe through the reinterpretation of other traditional aspects or culture from, before how cinema was kind of repurposed, maybe, as in the movies that you mentioned, and maybe specifically if there are any cases where characters very related to the rural parts of Ukraine, maybe those who had moved from the rural parts into the urban landscape were introduced in movies and such.
That's an excellent question. The theories of national cinema normally omit language as a criterion of nationality of the cinema. In Ukrainian case, it's a specific, the language is the criteria of Ukrainian identity, in the sense that when the language is removed from the equation, there is no much difference between Ukrainian and Russian. And Ukrainian has been the target of Russian policies directed at erasing or assimilating Ukrainians as a separate identity. And in that sense, the language becomes central in film once the film starts talking, because film strengthens, kind of consolidates the language, and with it a sense of difference, of another identity. The Soviets used the film programmatically as a tool of Russification, and I'm not talking about only linguistic Russification, but also cultural Russification. And at certain point, the function of that instrumentalization of Soviet film was the kind of self-imagination of Ukrainians as an identity that has no future, that belongs in the past. I remember as a generation born in the early 60s, people of my age didn't want to be Ukrainian. They kind of carried Ukrainian as this inherited feature of Ukrainians as a kind of a stigma, social stigma that had to be hidden, and not least because that was the kind of pressure exerted on our imagination by what we saw on the silver screen. There were no Ukrainian characters you would want to be. You would want to be a Russian, you would want to speak Russian, you would only open up to somebody like yourself when nobody hears you. And that's why Ukrainian language, in Ukrainian case, is really focal as a point beyond which Ukrainian identity is no more. And that's a special, because it doesn't work the same way in other cases with other nationalities. I don't know if I answered your question.
Can I just ask one really quick question? It's a factual question, because the competition brief for the monument said that the projects were supposed to be kind of anti-monumental, right? It stipulated
It was
that.
supposed
So how
to
many
come up with
other
a new version.
how many other
I haven't-
projects were
Thank you
there?
for this question.
And were there any modernist ones, or were they all?
Thank you for
were
this
they
question.
all? Yeah.
Can I ask you all a question? That's what I'd most like
Oh,
to do.
right.
I have no idea, right? I haven't seen the very last example of New Generation might have something about this in, but it might have finished in time. Has anyone ever, or could anyone find out if this was ever published, the results of this competition, or who the entries were? Because I have no idea. I
It's
only
homework
know.
for everybody.
I'd also like help with the translation, but what I'd really like to know is, sitting in a box is a 1 to 10 model of this monument. Is there an interesting way of exhibiting it right now while other people are questioning how to live with the tyranny around us? And because it's been built by the Bauhaus, it's sitting at Bauhaus Dessau at the moment in the cellar, and it's actually got screens built into it. So we could invite curatorially.
It's a new model.
It's a brand new model, it hasn't been shown yet.
Okay.
And we're waiting for the right moment to exhibit it because there's a war on at the moment, and it doesn't feel like the sort of things we should be focusing on. But listening to this conference, and it was you who said this is not just the moment, it's the critical moment. I was wondering, what's this thing doing in the basement right now? Maybe it could be useful. So that's the question
Now people know it's in the basement.
Let's put it after the war in Kharkiv, we can construct it.
Or do we have to wait till after the war? Is this the critical moment? That's my question. Is it
Do the next iteration
Paulina.
in the storm.
Paulina has an idea. Yeah.
Like about, so I recently made something for my students about it, and my students felt really guilty going to museum and enjoying something beautiful. And what I did, the idea of attention is a construct, and the attentive subject is a disciplinary construct. And if you look through the theoretical literature, you will see that this idea that your attention can be dispersed, and that if you enjoy something beautiful or if you enjoy art, it will take something from your alertness towards injustice. And this is actually an essay of Elaine Scarry on beauty and injustice, and she writes a bit more in detail about this. So this idea is completely nonsensical. So you can be alert to injustice, and you can be in the same way. It is also like the same sensitivity that is required, but you can be also enjoying something beautiful, enjoying art and culture. So suspending some projects, I think, during especially solidarity projects during the war moment, I don't think it makes any sense.
Okay, so what's next? Is there a discussion?
No, that's it.
Would you know what to say? Well, thank you first.
Okay, I'll be super brief with my closing remarks because I think all of us are desperate for food. I definitely am. On behalf of Masha and myself, I want to say enormous, gigantic thank you to all of our speakers and chairs. This has been, it will take us a lot of time to digest all of the information that was presented over the last 2 days. Pani Miroslava, you set the course, you kind of set us on the right track from the very start. You showed kind of the such a long-lasting traditions that we're still working today. Konstantin, I think you posed all the right questions that we should be addressing in how we construct narratives about Ukrainian art today. So let's cooperate and not colonize. Let's answer all of the questions. Let's help Dan, for example, answer his questions. The moment is indeed now, and I very much hope that all of the dialogues and discussions that were initiated yesterday and today will continue, and there is more to come. Thank you.